Over the next 3 hours, it's your chance to talk to author and syndicated columnist Mark Steyn. The theater critic turned political commentator will discuss free speech, America's debt, and the growth of Muslim populations in the West. Mr. Steyn's best-selling works include America Alone and his 2011 release, After America.
And Mark Steyn, in your 2006 book, America Alone, where did that title come from?
I ought to confess that title came from the publisher, from my editor at Regnery, a gentleman called Harry Crocker. I had a far more artful and elusive title that he thought was for losers and would guarantee we sold, 2,800 copies and was in the remainder bin. He thought America Alone was a hit title, and he proved right on that.
And what was your original title for it?
Oh, I'm keeping that to when I'm a multi-bazillionaire and I can afford to indulge myself by writing books with oblique, elusive titles that sell 2,400 copies. I'm going to revive it.
What is that book about?
Well, the book by my original title was on the same theme as America Alone. Eventually turned into, which is civilizational collapse, which is my shtick, as it were, is my little niche. And I think that what a good editor does, which is what Harry did for me at Regnery, is he identifies what your unique selling point is, and he gets you to focus on it. And he says, no, all this tap dancing around the issue in the first 50 pages is a waste of time. Get rid of that. Go straight in on this, and that's the book. And he was right on that. He was right on that.
And you write in America Alone, The End of the World as We Know It, it's hard to deliver a wake-up call for a civilization so determined to smother the alarm clock in the soft, fluffy pillow of multiculturalism and sleep in for another 10 years. The folks who call my book alarmist accept that the Western world is growing more Muslim, but they deny that this population trend has any significant societal consequences.
Yes, that's true. My book, when it came out in 2006, The Economist called it alarmist. My own magazine up in Canada, Maclean's magazine, called it alarmist. I think, in fact, it was insufficiently alarmist. If you look at, for example, in the Netherlands, you have explicitly Muslim parties organizing in local legislatures now. If you look at the city of Brussels, majority of people on the city council of the governing socialist caucus are Muslim. I was sent a picture yesterday of the city of London, the square mile, the biggest financial centre on earth, and the nearest Muslim mosque for city workers is too small, so they all take their prayer mats in the street and look towards Mecca, and so on Friday prayers the streets of central London, this street in central London is filled with Muslims looking toward Mecca and praying. And now you can argue that just adds to the general gaiety of life in a multicultural society, or you can argue that it's going to be a huge blessing, or you can do as I do and argue that in fact it puts a big question mark over those societies. But I think it's ridiculous to pretend that nothing is going to change about a society. There's a difference between if you look at Austria, for example, by mid-century it's predicted that a majority of Austrians under the age of 30 will be Muslim. That's what the Vienna Demographic Institute predicted. Now this is a country that most Americans don't think about. They think about, if you say Austria, they think of Julie Andrews prancing around with the nuns, singing How Do You Solve a Problem Like Maria. That was Salzburg 1938. Salzburg 2038 is How Do You Solve a Problem Like Sharia? I mean, that's like a complete inversion from head to toe in 3 generations.
You also note in America Alone that one of the most popular boys' names in Europe, in several areas of Europe, is Mohammed.
Yeah, and again, that's one where people say, oh, it doesn't. That's just because it has a particular significance in the Muslim world, and they go, you can only get to that statistic by adding up Muhammad with an O and Muhammad with a U and Muhammad with a double M and Muhammad with one M. But in point of fact, it is a significant marker. Cultural demographic transformation is always the most interesting, because who a society's human capital is the best indicator of where that society's headed. And generally speaking, while we tell ourselves certain fluffy and reassuring stories about demographic transformation, it doesn't always work out well. I mean, sometimes it works out messily in a relatively benign way. I'd say if you take, say, Northern Ireland, which is a place I know well, that's the fractiousness between what Catholics regard as a native population and an imposed Protestant population still linger hundreds of years after. If you look at Fiji, where the British brought in Indians, an Indian population, to be their civil service and mercantile class, Fiji has decayed in the last couple of decades, tragically, into a bicultural ruin. So demographic transformation is always, I think, the most fascinating element of society.
Why should we care, though? So what?
Well, if you put it in those terms, then we shouldn't care. It's just something that happens, but it never happens entirely naturally. I mean, for example, if you look in the southwest United States, where cities that were, if you take certain cities on the edge of California, on the edge of Los Angeles, for example, that were had a conventional post-war demographic and have now become 90 to 95% Hispanic. This is a demographic that wasn't even in the 1960 US Census. That's actually a big transformation in a fairly short space of time, and it has consequences. Now, when you put the why do you care question, I think I say in America alone, that's the benign view, that people think it's like, we were talking about Broadway just before we went on air. That's like the David Merrick production of Hello, Dolly, which he had Carol Channing in, and then he had Ginger Rogers in, and then he ran out of these sort of brassy, middle-aged, blonde broads, and so he put Pearl Bailey in the lead and made it an all-black cast. It's still Hello, Dolly. The songs are the same, the script's the same. It's just that it's a Pearl Bailey and an all-black cast. And people think that's what happens. That if you have a Muslim Netherlands or a Muslim Britain, that it will, you know, the Muslim Britain, there'll be fewer pubs. The pubs will have to close, but essentially it will basically still be the same. And I don't think that's, no serious person would argue that, I think. On
the cover of the new paperback, or the relatively new paperback version of America Alone, there's a little sticker that says, soon to be banned in Canada.
That's right. I was, as I mentioned, I write for Maclean's magazine up in Canada, or I did at the time, which is like the combination of Time and Newsweek combined up in Canada. It's the dentist's waiting room magazine. No offense to dentists or to my friends at Maclean's. They published a big cover story from the book, and the Canadian Islamic Congress took against it and filed 3 human rights complaints in the province of Ontario, the province of British Columbia, and at the Federal Human Rights Commission. And as a result of that, I've had the bizarre experience of finding my writing on trial in a courtroom in Vancouver, in which they flew in expert witnesses to discourse on the tone of the so-called tone of my jokes. Were my jokes merely in poor taste, or were they actually criminal? And they flew in, they flew in one of these, an expert witness from Philadelphia and a so-called expert witness from Toronto and all that. And it was fascinating. I mean, I'm flattered to be on this show and to be discussing my for 3 hours, but no disrespect, Peter, when it actually becomes the subject of a criminal trial in a Vancouver courtroom, I thought that was the kind of I thought the kind of literary criticism elements of the case were as absurd as anything else there.
What's the CIC and the Human Rights Commission in Canada? Well,
the CIC is the Canadian Islamic Congress. I mean, one of the other interesting features of the demographic transformation is, I mean, that's a reasonable name. I find there's something called I think the Supreme Islamic Council of Canada, or the Islamic Supreme Council of Canada, which always sounds slightly less friendly to me. I may do them an injustice. I used to be on the mailing list of the Supreme Islamic Council of Ireland, who were rather agreeable, in fact. They were rather agreeable correspondents. I don't know what Eamon de Valera would have made of it. I mean, I don't quite, or Michael Collins, I don't quite see the point of fighting to throw off the hated English oppressor if a couple of decades later the Supreme Islamic Council simply sets up shop in Dublin. But be that as it may, the Supreme Islamic Council of New South Wales down in Australia, I was also on their mailing list for a while. But they basically, I think a lot of these groups are concerned to put Islam beyond discussion. It's not even a question whether you say good things or bad things. In essence, in Muslim countries, Islam is beyond discussion. And I think it's a fascinating topic to discuss, and you should be allowed to discuss it. And so these fellas filed human rights complaints in Canada. Canada does not have a First Amendment, and so speech is policed by state bureaucrats. Which I think is an obnoxious idea, and I'm glad to say that since my case came along, we have managed to get Section 13, which is the relevant part of the Canadian Human Rights Code, actually kind of put on hold. They're not kind of a judge ruled that the Supreme Court should take some view of whether this was even constitutional or not, but in the meantime he wasn't going to apply it, and he essentially made the law unenforceable. And I think that's a good thing. I'm interested in free speech. I don't begrudge it. I run into all kinds of crazy opinions every day of the week, including right here on C-SPAN. I don't agree with them, but I don't want to criminalize them, and that's all I ask for my opinions too.
Are your books, Mark Steyn, allowed to be sold in Canada now?
Yes, they are. They are. I'm glad to say, still available in Canada. By the way, that soon to be banned in Canada is actually not merely a book tease. The statutory penalty, had the Canadian Islamic Congress won their case in British Columbia, would have been a lifetime publication ban for me on anything that on writing on anything to do with Islam, Europe, demography, terrorism, any of these issues. I could conceivably still have been the ballet critic of the Winnipeg Free Press, but had someone been offering Islam the ballet, had the Royal Winnipeg Ballet been offering Islam the ballet for their Christmas season, I would have had to recuse myself. So it was a lifetime publication ban, which is no small thing.
How well do your books sell up there?
Well, I'm glad to say America Alone was #1 bestseller. In fact, I think I hope I'm not giving anything away, but as you know, Regnery's books are very focused on American politics, and one of the ladies at Regnery said, "Well, you're basically our entire Canadian branch office." So it was a successful title up there.
So, Mark Steyn, how did you get from 2006 and America Alone to your most recent book, 2011, After America, Get Ready for Armageddon?
Well, my book, America Alone, argued that the other half of the Western world, essentially Europe, was putting itself out of business due to this combination of demographic weakness and the social democratic state. In other words, it had an upside-down family tree, unsustainable entitlements. Now, for example, in countries like Greece and Spain, where you have a fertility rate of 1.3, people say, what does it mean? It means basically that 4 grandparents have 2 children and 1 grandchild. And once you do that for a few years, it becomes very difficult for you to continue to pay your lavish pensions and benefits in a country where people retire at 52 or 53. The whole thing is, you basically, on any reasonable measure, those countries are insolvent. I argued my case so effectively in America Alone that basically in 2008 the great people of the United States voted to sign up for the same program supersized under Obama and the Democrats. And I think the great clarifying thing in the last 2 years is that more and more people understand the stakes. America is spending itself off the cliff on a scale that few nations have ever attempted.
And you write in After America that you cannot wage a sustained ideological assault on your own civilization without grave consequence. We are approaching the end of the Anglo-American moment and the eclipse of the powers that built the modern world, even as America's spendaholic government outspends not only America's ability to pay for it, but, by some measures, the world's, even as it follows Britain into the dank pit of transgenerational dependency, a failed education system, and unsustainable entitlements, even as it makes less and less and mortgages its future to its rivals for cheap Chinese trinkets. Most Americans assume that simply because they're American, they're insulated from the consequences.
Yes, and I talk about the Anglo-American moment there because I'm trying to frame it the way the rest of the world sees it. The French intellectual class thinks that a 2-century Anglo-American dominance is coming to an end, les Anglo-Saxons, as they like to put it. In other words, a particular view of the world that began, not to intrude on personal grief with the French, but that began at the Battle of Trafalgar and that has continued basically for 2 centuries since, is coming to an end. The Chinese take a slightly broader view and think that half a millennium of European dominance is coming to an end and the world is reverting to a natural Asiatic view of things. And I think that's not a view, whether on the American left or the American right. That's not really how Americans look at what happened. I mean, I think the 1950 American moment, which we're at the tail end of, the 1950 American moment, America emerged from the Second World War, was really the only developed nation whose factories and manufacturing hadn't been bombed to smithereens. And so it had a unique dominance. And as Europe recovered, and as China and then India and Brazil got in the kind of capitalism game and the global trade game, America still thinks of itself in the sense of that 1950 moment, but it was just a moment. And it was also, as I say in the book, it's like the smoothest transfer of global dominance in history. Roosevelt extracted a very tough deal in return for propping up the British Empire after the fall of France. And if you look at in a sense, Britain mortgaged its global networks to the United States. That's why there was a US base in Bermuda. That's why you have NORAD in Cheyenne Mountain, where Canadian officers sit next to American officers. That's where the ANZUS alliance in Australia, New Zealand, the United States, that countries, Britannia's lion cubs, who once, before the Second World War, what mattered was getting a good hearing in London. What mattered after the Second World War was getting a good hearing in Washington. This is the smoothest transfer of global dominance in history, from Britannia to her greatest, if somewhat prodigal son. And it's so smooth that nobody even thinks of it as such. People think of it as just a sort of natural phenomenon. It wasn't. It wasn't. It's a very rare moment in human history. And the idea that it's going to go that way round in, say, 2016, when the IMF predicts that China will become the dominant global economy, is absolutely absurd. You know, who is going to play America this time round? Britain and Europe's decline was cushioned by the United States as the global order maker. Who is there out there to cushion America's decline? There's no good answer to that question.
Mark Steyn, in After America, you have a time traveler. How do you put that together?
Yes, I use H.G. Wells's The Time Machine, which, as I'm sure many of your viewers know, if only from the rather cheesy, cheap movie versions that they make from time to time. This is a guy who basically, he's in Victorian London, and he creates a time machine, and he goes 800,000 years into the future, where to discover a world where humanity is divided into 2 different species. And it's actually a very prescient book in a way that most futuristic fiction isn't. The only thing that H.G. Wells got wrong is that instead of being 800,000 years later, it showed up pretty much 100 years later. So he was off by whatever it is, 799,900 years. But other than that, he was pretty spot on. And I use a Victorian time traveler, and I pitch him forward to 1950.
From 1890.
1890 to 1950. he would be, and I think of him as I was I don't think I made it explicit in the book, but as I was thinking it, I was thinking of someone in my small town in New Hampshire, you know, the great-grandparents of some of my neighbors. And if you propelled someone forward from one of those clapboard houses in 1890 to 1950, they'd be astonished. The transformation, the automobile had conquered distance. It no longer took you the best part of a day to go to the neighboring town and back. That had conquered distance. The electric light bulb had conquered night. Now you could determine the length and duration of your own days. You go in, there's a wireless on the countertop, and there's a full orchestra playing from it. There's a device that keeps your milk fresh. You don't need the iceman anymore. There's washers and dryers. There's a telephone that rings and you can speak to someone on the other side of the continent. There's a big bird in the sky, a metal bird in the sky that will fly you across the ocean to London or to Paris or to Rome. Now you pitch that, and he'd be amazed. That guy would be amazed. The fundamental contours of his world, time and distance, have been entirely reconfigured. Now you pitch him forward another 60 years, and he'd be excited. He'd be saying, wow, if this is what it's like in 1950, what is it like in 2011, 2012? And in fact, when he gets to 2012, the kitchen looks pretty much the same. The car looks pretty much the same. It's got a jack to plug your MP3 player into, and it's got more cup holders than it used to. The fridge has maybe got an ice maker in it, and it's got 15 stupid stickers telling you when you've got to go recycle which stupid stuff down at the dump put out for recycling days or whatever. But basically the telephone has buttons instead of a dial. But basically nothing much has changed except for the personal computer, which most people use in a kind of Aldous Huxley sense for entertainment purposes. You notice when I find it very odd when Steve Jobs starts saying, oh, just before he died, people talking about the new iPhone and the various products and things, and they're great and they're terrific, but there has to be more to a society than just inventing a slightly smaller device on which to download Justin Bieber or Lady Gaga or whatever. And I don't think we're making progress on that front. Now, it actually takes longer to fly from New York to London than it did in the late 1950s, by the time you add in all the shoeless shuffle and all the other stuff. So we're not making progress on a lot of these things.
This is Book TV on C-SPAN 2. Every weekend, 48 hours of non-fiction book coverage, and once a month, the first Sunday of every month, we have our in-depth program, and this month the featured author is Mark Steyn. We have one author on to talk about his or her body of work, and Mark Steyn is the author of 9 books. Here they are, a rather eclectic collection, beginning in 1997 with Broadway Babies Say Goodnight, The Face of the Tiger in 2002, From Head to Toe came out in 2004, America Alone, which we have talked about, came out 6 years ago, Passing Parade also came out in 2006, The American Songbook in 2008, A Song for the Season also in 2008, Lights Out in 2009, and his most recent bestseller is After America. Mr. Steyn will be with us for the next 2.5 hours to take your calls, emails, and tweets. The numbers are up on the screen. 202 is the area code for all of our numbers. 737-0001 if you live in the East and Central time zones. 737-0002 for those of you in the Mountain and Pacific time zones. You can also contact us by email, booktv@cspan.org, or send Mr. Steyn a tweet. Our Twitter address, twitter.com/booktv. Mr. Steyn, when did you start writing?
I started writing at school. I always liked writing. I think it's very difficult to be a writer if you don't, because it's actually physically unpleasant work, I think. And certainly if you started in the days of manual typewriters and carbon ribbons and things, it's physically unpleasant work to do, and it's antisocial work to do as well. You know, a lot of writers lead very dull lives, and when I was when I was a boy, and I liked writing, and I liked finding out about writers. And the writers I liked mostly had incredibly tedious lives. P.G. Wodehouse, for example, who was an incredibly prolific writer, and a marvelous writer, and a splendid writer, and had really an utterly boring life. I mean, he spent his last, whatever it was, 6 decades sitting at his home out on Long Island. He'd get up in the morning and type, and then he'd watch daytime soap operas, which he became, you know, inordinately fascinated by, and then he'd go to sleep, and he'd do the same the following day. The ones I always liked, and the ones I always hoped to be like, Ian Fleming, for example, the creator of James Bond. Ian Fleming had a fascinating, he was like P.G. Wodehouse. He lived in Jamaica. He liked to get up in the morning, and he'd write for a few hours, and he'd write a certain number of words, and then he'd go like scuba diving with Ursula Andress and have lunch with Noel Coward. And I thought, it would be great. Wouldn't that be great? You know, you'd type for a couple of hours, you go scuba diving with Ursula Andress, and have lunch with Noel Coward. What a way to live! And for alas, for 99.99% of writers, it doesn't quite work out like that.
How did you begin by writing about Broadway musicals and music?
I always loved music. I started as a disc jockey. I was in radio when I was a teenager, and I was a disc jockey. I wasn't a terribly good disc jockey, but I was good enough, and I got fired. And if you get fired and you've got no other skills, writing is one of the few things you can do. If you've got no other qualifications that would commend you to an employer, you should write. And I wrote a piece and mailed it off, and it got published, and I got a check for a 3-figure sum. I don't believe I'd ever got a check for a 3-figure sum before, and I thought, oh, this is great, I can live off this for 3 months. Well, I'd spent it all within 48 hours, so I then had to write something else, and that became a habit. And I started writing about, because I'd been in a disc jockey and I loved music, I started writing about that area, and I always liked, you know, again, to go back to talking about favorite writers, I mean, a lot of my favorite writers were songwriters. If you're a foreigner, one way you learn about, particularly about the American language and the muscularity of the American vernacular, is through popular song. And so I'd always been interested in that, and I started writing about that, and it was a kind of undernourished area at the time I was doing it, and I managed to find a little niche there. And that's good advice for any writer. If you can find, if you write about certain topics, they're kind of competitive. In my generation, you know, there were a lot of people who wanted to be like rock critics. And because 99 out of 100 guys want to be rock critics, if you then decide you're going to be the guy who writes about show tunes and Tin Pan Alley and that kind of stuff, that's actually far less competitive, and you can clean up there while all the third-rate rock critics are you know, working very over-tilled soil.
How do you transition from Broadway to current events and politics and demographic changes?
Well, I wouldn't have, really, if all was going well. I started writing about show business type topics, and I started then doing TV and movie criticism, and after a while, observant editors start to see that you've got like a kind of, you'll write about the political subtext of a movie or something like that, and you start to make an interesting political point somewhere when you're, I don't know, you're reviewing Schindler's List or something like that, and you get moved into that sphere. But I don't, in my heart of hearts, I think almost, and particularly since the internet came along, I do think, in a way, almost anybody can comment on that kind of stuff. I mean, you don't really need to. I think there's a difference in journalism between, you know, you can't wing it as a ballet critic. You can't say, well, at this point, a woman in a kind of pink, fluffy sort of dress that isn't terribly long came out and she wore funny-looking shoes, and she sort of twirled around for a bit. and then she went up on one toe and sort of held it for a while. It was kind of impressive. You can't do that if you're a ballet critic. You've got to know about ballet. Whereas if you're a general politics, you know, anybody with any wit should be able to do it. So I think it's a slightly it's a slightly less elevated. It's hard to do well, but anybody can do it to a sort of acceptable level, I think.
Where did you grow up, Mark Steyn?
I was born in Toronto. I had a little bit of a peripatetic childhood. I was at high school in the United Kingdom at Tolkien's old high school. I wasn't there at the same time as Tolkien, but I did actually have his Greek dictionary. And I'm always impressed. I got briefly, you know, like anybody who lives in small town New Hampshire, I take an interest in school board politics, and I'm always amused when teachers come and say, oh, you know, we're using some of the same textbooks we were using in the late 1980s, as if the laws of physics have changed in the last 20 years. Well, I had J.R.R. Tolkien's old Greek dictionary, which he'd had several decades before me and was still going strong. So Tolkien did better than me. He got into the movie business and cleaned up, but I'm kind of somewhere in the lower ranks of impressive alumni from that institution.
How did you get from Canada to schooling in England to New Hampshire and conservative politics?
Well, to answer the conservative politics and the New Hampshire, that's an interesting. I was on an overnight train, Amtrak, from Montreal to New York, and it broke down halfway. And they threw us off the train, and after a while they sent a van to collect us in the cold and took us to an inn. And I drew the curtains in the inn and thought, wow, it's actually quite nice around here. And I went to, I thought New Hampshire I hadn't really thought about. And I certainly hadn't thought about it in political terms, and I went into a realtor's intending to buy a little ski condo, maybe for a couple of weekends and a week over Christmas. And in the classic disastrous real estate story, I came out 20 minutes later with a 200-year-old farmhouse that needed 200 years worth of work doing on it. And I loved it. I still love that farmhouse, and I love the land. And that's what I fell in love with. But what was interesting is that as I sort of got into the rhythms of my town, I came to appreciate what Tocqueville appreciated, which is that the New Hampshire system of town government, as he said, is the best system of government known to man. So I came there for the beautiful white mountains and the beautiful lakes and streams and the quaint clapboard houses. But what I really loved was the system of town government. And the first time I went to town meeting, and I sat there, and there was a proposal, I think, to build a $500 fence round the town dump. And some old coot in plaid stands up and he says he doesn't really think we need a $500 fence. We could easily get by with just a $300 fence. And everyone talks about it for an hour, and they compromise and vote for like a $360 fence. And I thought that was a fantastic system of government. Where it breaks down is when you get, obviously, to the $16 trillion of debt nationally. People tend to say, whoa, the same old plaid-clad coot who would argue for an hour about beating the $500 fence to down to $340, somehow accepts that $16 trillion is way above his pay grade, and you should just let, it doesn't really matter if you add 3, 6, 9 zeros to the end of that, because it's all in cloud cuckoo land to him. And so I wish we could find a way to apply the level of scrutiny of New Hampshire town government to the national budget. But that's really what it is. I came for the hills and lakes and stayed for the politics.
Mark Steyn is our guest here on Book TV on C-SPAN 2, and the first call up for him comes from Carlene in Newton, Massachusetts. Hi, Carlene.
Hi. Mark, I would like you to talk a little more about American decline, and do you think that means that the United States must share the wealth that it's had a dominance over for the last 50 years? It has to share that wealth more with the rest of the world?
Well, it doesn't really have that much wealth left to share, Carlin, because when you're $16 trillion in debt, when you're got maybe 10 times that in unfunded liabilities in terms of the entitlements, you're mortgaging initially wealth but also power to your rivals around the world. I think for example, you're in Newton, Massachusetts. Every single dam on the Connecticut River is now owned by a Canadian company. Certain ports in the United States are dominated by the Chinese. The Chinese are buying up resources all over the world. Simply put, if you outspend, if you live beyond your means, you wind up without any wealth. And that is the situation that the United States is in. The United States has joined the rest of the Western world in voting itself a lifestyle it has not earned. And we have looted the future to bribe the present. You can do that for a little while, but eventually it catches up with you, and that's the situation we're in today. These are extraordinary sums of money, you know. When you're talking about the federal deficit just in 2011 of $1.6 trillion, I think it's $1.58 trillion, the official number. I mean, that is a scale of overspending that is unprecedented. We make these comparisons with Greece, but in the end, Greece is just talking about a few rinky-dink little billions. Here it's the hard dollar sums. And it's not a question of sharing it with the rest of the world. The post-American world is already being built before our eyes. And the question is whether we're going to get serious about this colossal, and I would argue actually profoundly immoral overspending before it's too late.
Mark Steyn writes in After America, when something goes wrong, a European demands to know what the government's going to do about it. An American does it himself, or he used to. If we can't do it ourselves when it comes to painting schoolrooms or building bridges, we should certainly confine it to the least remote level of government. Mr. Steyn, Rock Dots tweets into you, come on Steyn, talk about the heathens who live across the river in Vermont.
Well, Vermont, to go back to that little story I told you about the Amtrak service breaking down, the overnight between Montreal and New York, they actually threw us off on the Vermont side of the river. I was so innocent in those days that I didn't really appreciate the difference between Vermont and New Hampshire, the difference the Connecticut River makes. You know, Vermont is a beautiful state. But Vermont, for example, I used to joke that, you know, Vermont was America's leading Canadian province. But in fact, it's worse than that. Vermont is actually a candidate for membership in the European Union. Its demographics are so low. I invite anyone to travel up Route 5 or historic Route 100 in Vermont, stop in the schoolhouses. They're all emptying out because families, young families, can't live in Vermont. There's nothing for them to do. People think that the difference between Vermont, you know, somebody said years ago, because journalists in particular hate coming to my state. They hate coming to New Hampshire. You know, I think some guy in the Washington Post said, "Oh God, New Hampshire primary season again. What a hellish state. The only meal you can get after 6:30 p.m. in the evening is breakfast. It's got the most vicious newspaper in America, the Union Leader. Its contribution to culture is Motorcycle Week in Laconia. It's a hideous state." Whereas Vermont's got all the fluffy stuff. Vermont's got like Ben & Jerry's ice cream and you know, but Ben & Jerry's is part of the Anglo-Dutch multinational Unilever. It's got these two old hippies fronting it, but it's actually part, and they say, you know, they're supporting, you know, oh, we're with the 99%. They're a part of it. They're a wholly owned subsidiary of an Anglo-Dutch multinational. They should be called, if they were called part of Unilever, if they were called Uniben or Jerry Lever, you'd understand the point of it. But they're in fact, I ordered a stove from Vermont Castings Wood Stoves, because I thought I'd just done an event with Howard Dean, and we'd been very Vermonty together, and I was thinking getting a Vermont Castings wood stove, that'd be great, you know, just the sort of thing just sort of has the whole, the very name has that small town Green Mountain folksiness where me and Howard would sit around the wood stove shooting the breeze about. It came from Mississauga, Ontario, the Vermont Castings wood stove, from some sinister Canadian corporation. I mean, this is none of Vermont's boutique, so-called boutique businesses are Vermonty at all. The state is the state. I love the way whenever you meet a young person in Vermont. My daughter, bless her, has actually just started high school over on but my town doesn't have a high school, so she goes over the river to high school in Vermont. And
public school?
Yeah, it is. It is. I'm happy to say. Well, I'm not that happy to say, but it is a public school. And what I find interesting is if you talk to any young person in Vermont, their whole ambition is to work for a non-profit. You say to them, oh, what are you going to do? They say, well, I'd really like to work for a non-profit. Any particular kind of non-profit, you know? Is it, no, they don't, is it community organizing in southern Vermont or saving people from the Ebola virus in the Congo? Oh, they don't care, as long as it's working for a non-profit. The entire state of Vermont is a non-profit, and the tragedy of the United States of America is it's becoming the world's largest non-profit. And I think at a certain level that kind of civilizational ennui in which we think virtue is doing some feel-good activity rather than going out and creating primary wealth is very destructive to society.
Next call from Mark Steyn comes from Oxford, California. Shirley, you're on the air.
Hello there, Mark. It's nice to talk to you. I just feel like you're a lot of things that you say are kind of a caricature of the conservative movement, and I don't see much depth in that. But I wanted to ask you how you felt about the arts programs. There's a soundbite that's been put out by the conservatives called entitlements, but when I think about really, there's a lot of untapped talent in America and a lot of beauty and inside of the dignity of many human beings. And you, as you are very knowledgeable about the arts and things like that, it takes nurturing, it takes money. And I wondered what you thought about where the money is going in America and why there is this, it seems to be the primary concern of the conservatives is the money aspect versus the development of human dignity and the progression of civilization.
Well, dignity is a very interesting word, Shirley. And I think it's worth sticking with that. That I'm not objecting, and this is, by the way, where I have a few differences with my so-called fellow conservatives. I don't think this is a green eyeshade issue. I don't think the debt is a green eyeshade issue. It's not an accounting problem. It's not a bookkeeping problem. It's not something you give to H&R Block to solve. The brokenness of America, the fiscal brokenness of America is merely a symptom. The underlying problem, I think, is that we would not be in this situation, nor would many other Western countries, if it weren't for the kind of people we are. That's actually far more. That's a fairly obvious point, but I think it's one worth making. Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, every time the Greeks spend their latest bailout and come to her and say, okay, we've spent that, we need some more of your money, please. Angela Merkel understands that at a basic level, the problem in Greece is not the Greek finances, but the Greek people. And that is the problem with the United States and most other Western countries too. And you saw it, for example, in the riots in London last summer, which I actually prefigured in After America. I don't claim to be a genius, but my chapter on Britannia called The Depraved City is actually, if I do say so myself, which I do, an eerily prescient portrait of what happened a few weeks later when the riots broke out in London, in which people claimed to be attacking the rich. And by the rich, they meant the guy, often an immigrant guy, often a Hindu or a Muslim, who gets up in the morning and goes to work and opens the corner store and stands there at 6 in the morning and works at that store till 9 in the evening. These guys trash those stores, they smash them, they rampage through them, they set them alight. And they didn't mean, when they said they were, quote, the rich, unquote, they didn't mean they were rich. They're not rich in any kind of Warren Buffett sense, or even a tenth or a hundredth of that. What they meant is that they got up and went to work in a way that these people rioting in the streets had no need to. These were people who were the children of dependency, who had been marinated in dependency all their lives. And to come back to that word you used, dignity. Dignity is implicitly connected with somebody supporting themselves, doing a job, finding self-worth in that job, building a home, supporting their families. That is where dignity arises. And what is horrible about big government is not that it debauches a nation's finances, but that ultimately it corrodes the soul of a people. And that's why, whatever other conservatives may say, I'm not all about the money. I wouldn't want these programs if Bill Gates wrote a check to cover them every month. It's what they do to the people that's the problem.
In After America, Mark Steyn writes, so among America's elite, there are many non-political members, comfortable, educated beneficiaries of the American dream, who just want to get on with their lives. For these people and many others, liberalism is the soft option, the one with all the nice words: diversity, tolerance, peace, social justice, sustainability, and the position that requires least defending if you happen to be at a dinner party and the conversation trends toward current events. If you have to have opinions, these are the safe ones. They're not really opinions, are they? Just the default settings of contemporary sensibility. Mr. Steyn, you go on then to talk about the bumper strip coexist. What is it about that that bugs you?
Well, I think the laziness of multiculturalism is that it absolves you from having to think about the differences between people. If you think about it, saying that we're all the same is actually profoundly insulting, because it's not true, apart from anything else. A Muslim out in Yemen does not think he's the same as some secular gay couple in San Francisco just on their honeymoon in a nice Vermont bed and breakfast. He doesn't think they're the same, and so it's nice to think that the nice Shishi gay couple can live at 17 Elm Street next to the big bearded imam with 4 child brides at 19 Elm Street, but it's actually more complicated than that. I think multiculturalism absolves you from having to know anything. I was taught by multiculturalists. I'm kind of the last generation. A lot of the teachers who taught me had taught all kinds of cultures all over the planet, and they knew all kinds of fascinating things about other cultures. And if you are interested in other cultures, you know, Nepal is fascinating because it's not like Connecticut. The jungles of New Guinea are interesting because they're not like Massachusetts. And there's something incredibly lazy about that coexist sticker, which starts with the Muslim crescent, and it has, I forget what the O is, and
peace sign.
The peace, of course, the peace sign, and then it's got the Star of David in there, and I think one of them is the sort of male and female symbols, which are something to do with transgendered bathrooms or something. I don't know. I can't. It all gets very complicated. But the point is, the point is that's an attitude, and I find attitude, whether the kind of attitude alone, whether it's just that, wow, I think I mentioned in that book a guy I was driving behind in Vermont. Everyone in Vermont drives at 15 miles an hour, so you have a lot of time to look at their bumper stickers. And I'm behind this guy with like a peace through music bumper sticker. And I'm thinking, what is that guy on about? Peace through music. The Taliban banned music. Good luck with that. Is he even aware of that? And no, it doesn't mean that. It means that this guy can sit on his porch, do a little weed and strum his guitar and think that he's making a great contribution to humanity. He's not. His bumper sticker absolves him from having to think about humanity. And I find that I'm increasingly irritated by attitude. And it doesn't matter, you know, I was at the airport and I saw a guy I saw one of my kind of guys, a conservative guy. He was in a Don't Tread on Me t-shirt. and the Transport Security Administration were treading all over him. They had their hands in his underwear. So he was being trod all over in his "Don't Tread on Me" t-shirt. Attitude isn't enough, whether it's attitude on the right or on the left.
Next call for our guest, Mark Steyn, comes from Des Moines. Is it Syria?
Yes.
Please go ahead with your question.
Thank you. Hello, Mark. You spoke about H.G. Wells and also Steve Jobs, and I was wondering what you see in our future as far as our right to privacy, because even though computers are getting smaller, we're now living in sort of an Orwellian Big Brother is watching all of us, what with the Black Spider supercomputer and all the surveillance cameras out and about, and employers checking through the computers and know more about you than you may even know yourself.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree with that. I regret to say even the C-SPAN building asked for picture ID as I attempted to gain access to the building, and it's very common in our world. And I write about that a bit in After America, because I think we're actually bifurcating into two different societies. I'm always astonished at the number of government numbers and picture ID you have to give for even routine transactions in society today. The idea that it always amuses me when you're at Radio Shack and somebody's buying a $70 radio, and the guy asks for the Social Security number, and they give the number. It's astonishing to me. But I think we're actually dividing into two different kinds of society. There's one group, one part of the planet. Everything is known about them. You mentioned the security cameras. They're big on this closed-circuit television in the United Kingdom. If you notice them, they're all over London. By some measures, Britons, as they go about their daily business, are more photographed than any other people on the planet, except the North Koreans. It's an astonishing thing for a land that was once the crucible of liberty. And at the same time, there's another world, if you go to Waziristan or Somalia or Sudan, where nobody knows anything. There's no records. There's no... the Pentagon will send an unmanned drone over there and drop a bomb on some village, and if they're lucky they'll get the right people, or they might just get a couple of guys who have a similar name to the people they were trying to bomb. Those people are entirely off the grid, as my New Hampshire neighbours would say. So you have these highly surveilled people in the United Kingdom, and then people who are entirely off the grid in Waziristan and Somalia and what have you. And I find it then interesting, if you apply that model to California. In California, if you're in the lawful, legal part of the community, you're basically living as they are in London under the closed-circuit television camera. You need permits for everything in California. It's a disgusting regime in California that criminalizes almost every activity. You can't, if you own a hardware store and you want to give free coffee to your customers, you can't do it without getting $1 bazillion worth of permits from the relative health and safety board. They're regulated, inspected, watched constantly, 24/7. At the same time in California, there's this huge illegal population that does what it likes. You drive through the illegal part of town, and on a small lot there'll be 6 different dwellings. There'll be electrical wires snaking from the house to a rusting RV, to a trailer, to a large pickup truck, and all kinds of people living in there. They're not in compliance with anything. So they're like overlapping area codes in an American city. You have the half of the population that has to submit to total control by the Bureau of Compliance, and then you have the other half of the population that gets on with its life in the non-compliant, undocumented world. And I think as America gets poorer, you'll see a lot of people actually deciding that at a certain point it's more viable to move into the non-compliant, undocumented, the sort of Californian version of Waziristan, and live over there relatively unmolested by the state.
In After America, you write about Permitistan and Dependistan.
Right.
What are they?
Right. Well, I think the tragedy of big government is that it turns citizens into children who are wards of the state. I think LBJ's Great Society did that in a way that actually strikes at the heart of the American idea. What was attractive to America in the 19th, if you were a peasant in the 14th century Poland, you were a peasant in 19th century Poland, and the way to bet was that you'd be a peasant in 24th century Poland. So instead you got on a boat and you came to Ellis Island and you lived in a tenement on the Lower East Side, but your kid moved uptown and your grandkid went to college and got a nice place out in Westchester County, and then your great-grandchild got mixed up with Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and became an environmental wacko trying to destroy all the great industrial strength of the United States that had enabled your family to move up. That kind of mobility is destroyed by I think by big government. We are becoming there is declining social mobility in the United States, which in a way I think strikes at the very heart of the American idea, and transgenerational dependency is one of the worst examples of that.
Next call for Mark Steyn comes from Martha in Charleston, South Carolina. Hi, Martha.
Oh, hi, Peter. Thank you for another 3 hours of learning and C-SPAN.
Well, thanks for watching. It's good to hear from you. Last time we talked to you was when David McCullough was, we were doing the call-in with David McCullough.
Yes, all these great authors. I mean, isn't this a great country? Every state is so different, and to hear Mark talk about the differences between New Hampshire and Vermont, we always summer in Maine, and I think Maine's a very independent state. Former Governor King of Maine, who was independent, got me to start reading Tom Friedman's books and columns. And of course, Maine has 2 women senators, and the girls in Maine wonder if you can be a man and a senator. You know, it's just completely different from New Hampshire and Vermont. But I must say, when we traveled to New Hampshire this summer, when the flooding was just terrible, both Vermont and New Hampshire, everybody came together to help. I mean, they truly came together, even though Vermont and New Hampshire are quite different. In the parking lot there at White River Junction, all the people were helping with the flood victims, and I wondered if Mark could comment about that wonderful St. Gaudens National Park.
Yeah, that's a little ways south of me in New Hampshire, and was an artist colony, and is actually a beautiful part of the world. It's not far from where J.D. Salinger used to live. I doubt very much that J.D. Salinger ever did 3 hours with Peter in depth, because he was a recluse, and what I always found so odd about that was that he was everybody knew where he was a recluse in New Hampshire, like everybody knew where he lived. You know, it was, they might as well have had a sign on the interstate exit, you know, recluse land exit 9 or whatever it is. And but you know, you were talking about the community thing in New Hampshire and Vermont, and I would like to believe that. I was caught in Quebec in the 1998 ice storm that hit in January 1998. The totaled Quebec, the city of Montreal, eventually all the lights went out except for the Hydro-Quebec building. And at that point I thought, we're going to be stuck here for weeks if we don't get out. And we all climbed into the car and snaked our way south to the Vermont border post, tiny little Vermont border post, where the lights were on. You know, God doesn't know. Well, I guess he does know, but God at any rate does not inflict different weather patterns on the province of Quebec and the state of Vermont according to where the borderline happens to be. The lights were on in Vermont because they were better at dealing with the emergency than the province of Quebec had been. And what was fascinating to me, as I said, I live in New Hampshire, so I think of Vermont as generally a squishy, decadent state. But at that time, when you listened, I'd been listening to the radio in Montreal, and people were just calling up and going, oh, why doesn't the government do more for me? Why haven't they repaired this yet? Why haven't they repaired that yet? And the Vermont radio stations, by contrast, were full of all this practical advice on how you could, you know, how you could take steps to get, if you had no running water, the things you could do to clear ice blockage off the roof and all this kind of thing. And I think the expansion under Bill Clinton of the Federal Emergency Management Agency has actually been deeply harmful to the United States. It's not a big thing in the scheme of the general brokenness, but for example, Barack Obama has declared a federal emergency I think it's somewhere works out to something like every 2.5 days. We now declare so-called federal emergencies for nothing, for absolutely nothing. And I think I simply think that's a poor model on which to operate. And when I watch news in Vermont, they're waiting for this or that federal grant to come through or whatever. I think, come on, man. You know, these are people who are returning from the French and Indian Wars, returning from the surrender at Montreal when a continent changed hands in the early 1760s. They hacked their way through the undergrowth, down the Connecticut River and back to their homes in Connecticut. And on the way they decided this was great land, and they applied for town grants, and they were granted them by the colonial governor, and they cleared land and they built homes, and they withstood tough, grueling winters. One of my neighbors, her great whatever, was the first miller in town, and he dragged his mill wheels up the frozen Connecticut River from Connecticut to his new home in New Hampshire, and then built a mill in New Hampshire in a brutal winter in 1765, I think it was. And the idea that these people now, the descendants of these people, think that when you get a bad storm, you get an ice storm or whatever, you should apply to the Federal Emergency Management Agency. There would be no America. There would be no America if the first bad winter in the New England colonies, they'd send a complaint back to London saying, why hasn't King George's ye olde Federal Emergency Management Agency done anything for us? There wouldn't be no America. It's not healthy, this stuff.
Martha also mentioned Tom Friedman, and I'm not sure you share her opinion of Tom Friedman. I just want to read a little from After America. Talking about globalization. To its worshippers, globalization is some kind of mysterious metaphysical force that's out there remaking our assumptions about the planet. May the force be with you, because if it's not, you're just a Squaresville daddy-o receding in the rear-view mirror of history. The high priest of this cult is the New York Times in-house thinker and beloved comic figure Tom Friedman. Hardly a week goes by without the Times' most frequent flyer filing from a state-of-the-art departure lounge on the other side of the planet, marveling at its complimentary Wi-Fi, light rail link, and the way his luggage was brought in by cheery native bearers in traditional dress, playing some raucous Abkhazi Nauruan hybrid of gangster rap on an affordable new X-Pod iBox you can wear under your sarong, made at a state-of-the-art plant by a small Uyghur startup backed by a Herzogovine hedge fund. All of which makes a forlorn contrast with the scene that greets him when he lands back at Newark.
Right. And this is like journalism 101. You never write. When you're a global traveler, when you go around, you're never supposed to write about what the taxi driver says to you, right? If they fly you in, if your newspaper flies you into to southern Sudan, and you land and you get in the cab, you're not meant to write about what the cab driver says to you. You're meant to go beyond that. That's what they paid you for. And you're not meant to write about the departure lounge. And Thomas L. Friedman is in the happy position of his highly successful post at the New York Times of like jetting around the world. He proposed a peace plan to King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia a few years back, and King Abdullah, who knows how to flatter the New York Times guy, said, well, that's by coincidence, that sounds just like the peace plan I've got in my desk. So he flies around, he goes to see King Abdullah, then he goes to the airport, he flies on to see the Sultan of Brunei, then he flies on and he goes to see Putin in Moscow. So he's spending most of his time in airport departure lounges. And actually there are some fairly spectacular airports around the world, and Tom Friedman's point is that when you're in Singapore or Hong Kong and you fly back to LAX or Newark, as Thomas L. Friedman always says, it's like flying from the Jetsons to the Flintstones. This is his preferred pop cultural analogy. This is also Writing 101, by the way. It's often a good way when you're dealing with complex issues to find a pop culture analogy that will make it easier for people to understand. But the trick is not to use the same one over and over, which is what Thomas L. Friedman does with his Jetsons and Flintstones. He said in fall of 2001, after Afghanistan, he said in America, in Afghanistan, the Taliban were the Flintstones and America were the Jetsons, and the Jetsons always beat the Flintstones. Actually, that's not true. You know, anyone who you know what the Flintstones and the Jetsons are, don't you, Pete? I mean, but the Flintstones are the classic. The Jetsons are the sort of cheesy knockoff with a bit of space age, with a bit of a space age gimmick attached to it, and where the limitations of metaphor kick in very early is that in Afghanistan right now America, the Jetsons, are desperate to get out, and the Taliban, the Flintstones, know all they have to do is bide their time, and all will be theirs. In Afghanistan, the Flintstones are beating the Jetsons. It's not as simple as that all-purpose pop culture analogy.
Our live conversation with Mark Steyn continues. We have about 2 hours left in our program, and we'll be right back.
Here's a look at some of the books that are being released this week. James F. Simon details the struggle to bring the country out of the Great Depression in FDR and Chief Justice Hughes, the President, the Supreme Court, and the epic battle over the New Deal. In Killing the Messenger, a story of radical faith, racism's backlash, and the assassination of a journalist, award-winning investigative reporter Thomas Peale tells the story of murdered journalist Chauncey Bailey in Oakland, California in 2007. Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and first-time author Catherine Boo examines families in a struggling city in Behind the Beautiful Forevers, Life, Death, and Hope in a Mumbai Undercity. In Latin Lessons, How South America Stopped Listening to the United States and Started Prospering, Hal Weitzman, Financial Times Midwest Bureau Chief, examines the diminished role the United States is playing in South American trade and argues that the relationship needs to be re-established. Natalie Dykstra takes a look at why the wife of American historian Henry Adams decided to take her own life in Clover Adams, A Gilded and Heartbreaking Life. Look for these titles in bookstores this week and watch for the authors in the near future on Book TV.
Each year, Book TV brings you several events from across the country. Here's a look at some of the upcoming fairs and festivals we plan on covering this year. Book TV's first stop will be the 5th Annual Savannah Book Festival in Savannah, Georgia, over President's Day weekend. Our live all-day coverage on Saturday, February 18th will feature several author presentations, including Carl Merlantis and Pulitzer Prize finalist S.C. Gwynn. On March 10th and 11th, Book TV will be live from the Tucson Festival of Books on the campus of the University of Arizona. Our festival coverage includes numerous author talks and poets ranging from the Great Depression to forensic science. Then in late March, Book TV visits Charlottesville, Virginia for the Virginia Festival of the Book. For a complete list of upcoming book fairs and festivals, visit booktv.org and click on the Book Fairs tab at the top of the page. Also, please let us know about book fairs and festivals in your area, and we'll add them to our list. Email us at booktv@c-span.org.
And we are back live with Mark Steyn on In Depth. We're going to put the numbers up on the screen. If you would like to call in and talk with our guest, author of 9 books, 202 is the area code, 737-0001. For those of you in the East and Central time zones, 202-737-0002. Mountain and Pacific, email booktv@cspan.org and Twitter, twitter.com/booktv. And we're going to start with San Jose, California. Mary, you're on with author Mark Steyn.
Thank you. I'm a first-time caller, and this is going to be about Islam. Many years ago, an artist, Mapplethorpe, put a crucifix in a bucket of urine, and there was no Vatican reprisal. Synagogues are vandalized throughout the United States and other places, and yet there's no riots in Israel. And if you talk about burning the Koran halfway around the world, they start chanting death to America and burning effigies. There's televised beheadings. And so I guess, then they declare jihad, if a cartoonist writes some kind of cartoon about Islam or Muhammad. And so I guess my question is, why are we allowing ourselves to be so terrorized by these people, and why is this type of religion given preferential treatment around the world?
Well, just to correct something you said there, that it was actually Andres Serrano who did the crucifix in urine. Robert Mapplethorpe was did the homoerotic photographs with the bullwhip, which Pat Buchanan, if memory serves, Pat Buchanan, when he ran for president in 1992 against the first President Bush, put in a spectacularly inspired attack ad with President Bush. It's the first time I've ever seen George H.W. Bush edited into a homoerotic video, and it was splendid stuff. But it was Andres Serrano who did the crucifix in urine. And as you know, when you do something like that, somebody did a play in which Jesus was gay and having an affair with Judas Iscariot, Corpus Christi it was called, by Terence McNally on Broadway a few years ago, and Catholics held up placards on the sidewalk. If you had done that play about Muhammad, you would have had an entirely more motivated crowd waiting for you outside the stage door when you left in the evening, and that is why people don't do that kind of play about Muhammad. I was at a conference in Copenhagen a year and a half or so back with a fellow called Lars Vilks. He's not a right-wing wacko or anything. He's a conventional Euro-lefty, and like many Euro-lefties of his generation, he reserves the right to insult everybody. And they have a tradition in Sweden, where he lives, of what they call roundabout dogs, that people put up this art at traffic rotaries of various odd kinds of dogs. And he'd done one of Muhammad. He'd just done a drawing of Muhammad as a roundabout dog, since when he has lived under death threats. There were people shouting death to Vilks on the streets of Pakistan. He came home one night and found that a couple of people had firebombed his kitchen. Unfortunately, they were rather incompetent firebombers, and in setting his kitchen alight, they'd also happened to set their pants alight. So fleeing across the field with their flaming trousers, eventually it had got too hot for them, and they'd removed their flaming trousers and abandoned them in the snow and pranced off across the snowy field in their BVDs, and unfortunately making the mistake of leaving their driver's licenses and all kinds of other picture ID in their smouldering pants, enabling the police to go and arrest them. And everybody had a very good laugh about it, because like a lot of these fellas, they're incompetent. Like we would have laughed at the 9/11 guys had they been arrested on September the 10th, because they were incompetent. They went into a lap dance club and were the world's lousiest tippers, and we would all have had a laugh about them. These fellas are always jokes until they pull it off. And the tragedy is, Lars Vilks has learned the hard way that the left isn't there for you on free speech issues. The left would simply, all kinds of people have said this. It's easier in the end to mock Jesus, to mock Catholicism, to mock Christianity, to do all those tedious jokes like the crucifix in urine, because no one's going to come after you. If you're going to be provocative, it's best to do it with people who can't be provoked. And in that sense, Episcopalians and Congregationalists are the easiest target in the world.
Susan Freiberg from St. Paul, Minnesota emails into you, Mr. Steyn. Would you talk about the role religious faith has played in your life, and do you believe civilizations can recover their moorings without a religious anchor?
I was baptized a Catholic and confirmed an Anglican, and I currently am a member of a small American Baptist church, and I'm a kind of unassimilated immigrant as far as the American Baptist Church is concerned, because when all's said and done, I have a preference for the old Anglican hymns of my childhood. I regret what the Anglican Church has become. In fact, I think it's kind of sad and pitiful, but I still the Anglican hymns still stir me in a way that "How Great Thou Art" doesn't quite do it for me in the same way. As far as the broader point, I think I think it's very hard for any society to endure without some kind of transcendent purpose. All functioning societies are a compact between the past, the present, and the future. I don't think I'm the first to say that. Thomas Locke and Montesquieu and all kinds of people have understood that. It's not a particularly religious idea, but it's simply the fact that in human history, when it comes to that compact between the past, the present, and the future, religious societies are the best foundation for that. Just to go back to what we were talking about in Afghanistan, I have a line in After America. It's apparently an old Taliban saying, or not an old, recent Taliban saying. They say the Americans have all the watches, but we have all the time. In other words, I don't know if it is a genuine Taliban saying. It sounds to me rather like a rather lame country song, but it might be a Taliban saying. And they have a point. In other words, they're taking the long view. And I think it's very hard to take the long view without religion. I mean, post-Christian Europe, for example, is fascinating to me. Post-Christian Europe, and I use that phrase not provocatively, I use that phrase actually because a European commissioner used it to me once when we were talking about the state of the European Union, and he called it post-Christian Europe in an approving sense. In other words, we've thrown off all that mumbo-jumbo and we are building the perfect society. And in a way they did, but just for one generation, because it has no transcendent purpose. And it's very difficult. Even atheists, if they think about it, honest atheists will understand that their life will be more agreeable in certain kinds of society than it would in if you ask the average atheist, he would rather live in a Judeo-Christian society than in the Soviet Union, for example. You have to have some kind of transcendent purpose, and it's very difficult without religion.
Mark Steyn, R.S. Field tweets into you if you would talk a bit about George MacDonald Fraser and why he was an influence.
Well, I think this was on my favorite authors or favorite
list,
books.
Right, that we
yeah.
just showed.
What I love about him is George MacDonald Fraser, for people who don't know, he's the author of the Flashman books. About 40 years ago, the late 60s, he got the inspired idea to take a minor character in the 19th century novel Tom Brown's Schoolboys, the bully, and make him the central figure in what was essentially a history of the British Empire up to the early 20th century. In other words, George MacDonald Fraser inserted Flashmen into the first Afghan War, and I think actually in one novel into the US Civil War, and into Madagascar, where he winds up having sex with the most notorious queen of Madagascar, and all the rest of it. So he did I guess a Forrest Gump type of thing, in that he inserted this character of his into all these real life situations. P.G. Wodehouse loved that series. He read the first book and he said something like, it was, you know, the great sigh of contentment when you know that a series is being born and you're going to love it, love every one of them. But what I learned about that, and the reason I like him, is because after the Afghan invasion, when everyone was suddenly an expert on Afghan, graveyard of empire, Pashtuns, Uzbeks, you know, they're all suddenly the dancing boys of Kandahar. Everyone's an expert on Afghanistan. And I loved going back and reading, which I hadn't done since I was at school, reading George MacDonald Fraser's first Flashman book, where Flashman winds up, and almost, as I think of it, particularly after 10 long years, 10 thankless years in the Hindu Kush, reading George MacDonald Fraser Flashman on the Afghans and the Afghan society makes more sense than reading 3 Cups of Tea or any of that. As a writer, I mean, the reason I mention him as an influence on the writer, he's beautifully specific. His ear for 19th century vernacular English is marvelous, and his eye for detail is brilliant. And I'm very, just to go back to my little riff when I was talking about ballet in the previous hour. You know, the terrible thing, Peter, is, I'm not a great one for, you know, teaching writing. I think it's very hard to teach, but I do believe that the deeper you can dig, you know, you don't say the guy climbed into a car and drove away. It's better to identify what kind of car it is. And what I love about George MacDonald Fraser is he's dealing with something several generations removed from his own time, and yet the detail in the books is absolutely beautiful.
In your book, Lights Out, Islam, Free Speech, and the Twilight of the West, you have a column in there about a speech you make where you say that Muslim is the new gay. What does that mean?
Yeah, I was giving a speech at the Heritage Foundation, and somebody asked a question about what was a then new Canadian sitcom called Little Mosque on the Prairie, which, to go back to where we came in, I think is a hit title. I certainly think that's a great title. And I believe I said I hadn't seen the show, but my bet would be, I then said Muslim is the new gay. That's to say, I would bet the Muslims get all the best lines, like the way the gay characters do, the gay best friend does in an American sitcom or an American movie. Now, I'd said that because we were like in a room at the Heritage Foundation in Washington. And I said jokingly, oh, by the way, that's off, Muslim is the new gay. Oh, by the way, that's off the record. I want to make it home alive. And I hadn't realized the way it works these days is that the thing was being streamed live on the internet. And I had no idea. So it then turns up in the human rights complaint against me, the Canadian Islamic Congress, that among their complaints was that Steyn had said Muslim is the new gay. I then explained, well, you know, the point you're missing here, guys, is that I meant it as a compliment, which only made things worse, apparently. But I do believe that. I think Little Mosque on the Prairie is one of the sad aspects of our time is the effect of political correctness on comedy. I think Little Mosque on the Prairie is actually a great idea if you were honest about it. But if you do it in the way the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation does, whereby the Muslims are all the hip, cool characters, and the whites are just knuckle-dragging, inbred, stump-toothed prairie hicks, you're loading the dice, and you're making real comedy impossible. And one of the depressing features about all the free speech wars that I've been involved in the last few years is actually people who congratulate themselves on their edginess and transgressiveness all the time, which is stand-up comedians, comics in general, are actually the biggest wimps of the lot. I think that's a kind of tragedy. One of the most hilarious. I'm not a great internet surfer, but one of the most hilarious types of sites is where some guy has made an allegedly homophobic crack in a comedy club, and then you go to a so-called comedy website where comedians discuss whether he should actually back down and apologize, agree to attend re-education camp or whatever. These comedians are ridiculous. They might as well be court jesters to Kim Jong-il in their view of the sort of transgressiveness and edginess of comedy. And it illustrates the point, I think, that it's very hard. Once the sort of counterculture becomes the establishment, it's actually very hard to have a genuine counterculture. But the po-faced, politically correct cravenness of stand-up comedy is actually very depressing, I think.
Chad in Missoula, Montana, thanks for holding. You're on with author Mark Steyn.
Thank you. It's been an honor and a pleasure listening to you, Mark. I've been enjoying your views on liberty, fiscal, responsible government, and such, and I've been wondering, where do you stand on the Ron Paul phenomenon? And also, why is he reviled so much in circles of conservative commentary? Thanks.
Well, I'm glad to have Ron Paul there on the stage and Ron Paul there in the debates, and I think he makes a contribution. I certainly think I enjoyed it marvelously the night of the New Hampshire primary. Mitt Romney gave his usual stump speech of platitudinous generalities. You know, I believe in an America where all Americans can be as Americanly American as America has ever been, or whatever it is. And then Ron Paul comes out and starts talking about the Federal Reserve and the gold standard and fiat money, and it's kind of impressive in a way. And the crowd is cheering. And I like it. I'm all in favor of Ron Paul when he's there talking about small constitutional government, when he's hammering the Federal Reserve. Everyone thought he was a nut 4 years ago going on about the Federal Reserve. In 2011, the Federal Reserve bought something like 70% of the debt issued by the United States Treasury. Suddenly Ron Paul is looking a lot less like a nut on that, and there's a lot more people who share his views on the Federal Reserve. Where I part company with Ron Paul is the idea of an America that can live aloof from the rest of the world as a 19th century isolationist republic. There is no fortress America. This country can't even maintain its fortress against two relatively benign neighbors. Basically, half the population of Mexico has moved north, and 100% of every single disastrous Canadian idea, from multiculturalism to government health care, has moved south of the border. So there is no fortress America. And even as a 19th century isolationist republic, America was only able to enjoy that role because the Royal Navy maintained global order. The Royal Navy expunged slavery from pretty much most of the planet in the 19th century. The Royal Navy kept the Pax Britannica on the seas. The idea that America can retreat from the world and there will be no consequences to that, I think, is deluded. That doesn't mean, I happen to agree with him, that we're wasting an awful lot of blood and treasure in Afghanistan to no particular purpose. I happen to agree with him that I think the Pentagon would be able to operate with rather less resources than it does at the moment. But it's important that you have not just a leaner military, but a meaner military, and you have some sense of global strategy. The problem in Afghanistan is not that we haven't spent enough money, but that we've wasted so much money. And the reason we have is because of the lack of strategic clarity. And strategic clarity doesn't actually take a big budget. It takes half a dozen guys sitting around a table bought at some, Staples office furniture discount somewhere in the basement at the Pentagon. So it's the lack of strategic clarity. And Ron Paul's vision of a retreat from America, I think it will not make the world safer, and in the end will not make America safer, because in the end, as the British learn, in imperial retreat you're still the biggest target, and imperial resentments linger long after the Durbar has passed.
Mark Steyn is our guest this month on Book TV's In-Depth program, and the next call for him comes from David in Hampton Falls, New Hampshire. Hi, David.
Hi. Hi, Mark.
Hey, greetings to fellow Granite Stater.
Not only that, but I had the good luck to attend a one-room schoolhouse in Gilmanton.
Really? That's good. There was a lot more teaching going on in those one-room schoolhouses than the lavish facilities they're putting up these days.
And not only that, but I'm much more fondly attached to the one-room schoolhouse than to Yale Law School, for example, which I also attended.
That's good. Leave your worldly goods to your one-room schoolhouse. Yale Law School doesn't need it.
That's absolutely right. The question I have for you is, how closely do you identify with James Burnham's book, The Suicide of the West, in which he identifies liberalism as the cause of the decline of America?
Yeah, I think that's a book that stands up extremely well. That I think I would put it in the same category as Tocqueville's prophetic remarks in Democracy in America, that it's much easier to lose liberty incrementally. People, I think, have a deluded idea about how tyranny shows up. It's not always goose steps and jackboots. It's often in subtler ways, and I think both Burnham and Tocqueville and other writers share a sense of the enervation that comes with the incremental loss of liberty. I would nudge Burnham on a bit, because I think one of the big problems that I talked about in America Alone, and also in After America, though, is the demographic weakness. Which is that liberalism so corrodes even the basic survival instinct, for example, that in Europe it's led to collapsed birth rates. In America we're not in the same situation, but we have the basic problem that the baby boomers did not have enough children to pay for the mid-20th century entitlement programs. So in other words, we have very generous entitlement programs set up on the assumption of certain family sizes, and as those family sizes have shriveled, there's simply not enough young people working around to pay for that. That goes back to what I was talking about in Greece earlier. So I think I think Burnham is right on that. What he didn't foresee is that 40 years later, half a century later, is that we're in the situation now where even if you're trying to rebuild a society, you're actually starting off with far fewer young people and far more old people than you would wish to in a healthy demographic situation.
This email for you, Mr. Steyn. Although I disagree with Mr. Steyn's political views with little exception, I admire his wit and even his writing. In a similar vein, are there any current writers of the left that he admires? There is a certain rather famous editorialist that I can't help notice similarities. That's from Thurston Nabe.
Well, you know, one of the things I do enjoy. I started reading when I worked in Fleet Street, which is where I began as a journalist, and I always did enjoy reading left-wing critiques of me. And I think that's actually very pleasurable. There's in fact, I believe when I applied for my green card, I was obliged to send in some, information about me, and just as a joke, I'm not sure, I don't know whether my immigration lawyer wound up submitting it in the end. I wound up putting in a rather devastating left-wing critique of my writing that I thought was actually fabulously written, and I always look to find someone like that. And I have a problem with certain liberal writers, in that I hate it if you can see the formula, and I think any good writer does. And I have a problem with, say, I really shouldn't be even talking about this, but I have a problem with, say, Maureen Dowd at the New York Times, because I think you can too often see the formula. I'm sure, some people would say that about me, yet there's times when, I'm having to slough off a column in the 20 minutes at the airport after I'm rushing to catch a plane after a big 3-hour special on C-SPAN, and I've not put the full juice into it, and so I write it in the car on the way to the airport, and you can probably see the formula in that. But I think there's my problem with a lot of left-wing columnists is when, like with Maureen Dowd, liberal columnists, is where you can see the formula. Having said that, one of the things I miss about Fleet Street is I think it's nice to always mix it up a bit. And I remember when I was involved in starting the National Post in Canada, and John O'Sullivan, who was the editor, the op-ed editor up there, I remember him calling me before the paper started, and he said, "What left-wing columnist can we get?" And this was 1998, and I think I suggested Christopher Hitchens, because Christopher Hitchens was regarded as a man of the left then. And I loved reading Christopher Hitchens. He was a man of the left to the end, really, I think. He's not a conservative in any sense, but he was a well-read man. He was a literary man. He did not have his talking points that he regurgitated, and he had a kind of historical speak. But John O'Sullivan's point that even if you're a right-of-centre newspaper, you should have some left-wing voices in there, I think is absolutely right. And I think likewise, if you're a left-of-centre, I think it's sad. You got to have. I wrote for the Spectator in Britain for many years, and the Spectator always used to, it was a broadly conservative paper, but they used to get waggish lefties in, and I think that makes much more sense to do it that way.
This is probably a very unique email here at C-SPAN, that we've never gotten one that says what it says. Dear Mark, why do you think leftists hate Western civilization so much? Do you have a favorite American composer, Irving Berlin or Cole Porter?
That is, I wonder if, I'm not sure those two things he intends me to connect them up. That's great. Even better, it's from Silver Spring, Maryland. I love, if I was to name a composer, I think I named on my list of favourite authors a lyricist, Dorothy Fields. Dorothy Fields wrote the words to The Way You Look Tonight and Pick Yourself Up and A Fine Romance, and the guy who wrote the music for that was Jerome Kern. And I love Jerome Kern's music. Richard Rogers said of Jerome Kern wrote one of the greatest American songs of all time, Old Man River, from one of the greatest American shows of all time, Showboat. I love Jerome Kern's music. Richard Rogers said of him that he had one foot in the old world and one foot in the new. He was kind of the first great New York composer, and that is actually quite an astute observation by Richard Rogers, because he's kind of he was influenced by a lot of London operetta composers, but he's moving on before that. And if you go back and you listen to They Didn't Believe Me, that song is from 1914. What year are we now? 2012. So that song is 98 years old. They Didn't Believe Me. And I was in a club not so long ago, and someone sang that song, and it sounded as fresh and timeless. And if you had said this is some thing from 98 years ago, from a show nobody remembers, it's beautiful, that song. And that's Jerome Kern. Why leftists hate Western civilization, which is a far less agreeable topic to me. Look, here's the problem. You know, leftists are the beneficiaries of Western civilization. And you can't make a living as a multiculturalist anywhere except it's a unicultural phenomenon. You can only make a living as a multiculturalist in Western societies. You can't be a multiculturalist in Riyadh. It can't be done. And I think that's so. Celebrating diversity is a phenomenon that is only confined to a very narrow type of society. And I think these people are the sort of these people are the beneficiaries of a unique period of peace and prosperity, which is so boring. It is boring. Everyone would like the frisson of living in tumultuous times, and I think civilizational self-loathing gives you the frisson without the consequences. We're not yet in this state of the French Terror. Or the October Revolution, where there's blood running in the street or whatever. So it's fabulous. What could be better than being a tenured anti-Western professor at a Western university? You get 40 years living high off the hog of civilizational self-loathing without for a moment fearing that society and what's holding it up is ever going to crumble away. In fact, there's not a lot holding it up. So these guys are going to, unless they're 106 years old and in the late stages of avian flu, are actually going to live to see the consequences of what they've advocated. But I think that's what it is, a kind of civilizational ennui.
Manuel, you've been very patient from Cincinnati. Please go ahead with your question for author Mark Steyn.
Oh, thank you. Let's see, I'm a little nervous here, Mark, but hey, it's good to see you on TV, Mark. I look forward to it when you substitute for Rush.
Yeah, I enjoy doing that, because that is one of the jobs Americans will do. So it's a great honor for a foreigner to get to host some of those kind of things.
Yeah, hey, look, man, you're a patriot as far as I'm concerned. I'm a veteran, and I was brought up in Rhode Island, a big liberal state.
That's certainly true.
And but here's the issues I have on a political platform. Hypocrisy, first of all, in regards to transparency and the rule of law, and I'm just totally disgusted. I love this country, but you know, I'm just about ready to let them all have their way. You know.
Well, here's the problem, Manuel, and actually it's a Democrat who puts it bluntly. I mean, Pat Cadell, who worked for Jimmy Carter many years ago, Pat Cadell thinks we're setting in motion pre-revolutionary conditions. If you basically send people the message that elections and the actions and even the elections of their elected officials make no difference, you're giving people some very unpleasant options. In 2010, for example, there was a big, the Tea Party rallied their forces and achieved a result in the House of Representatives that was unprecedented for, at least for the last, whatever it is, 8 decades. But then nothing happened. The debt just goes on rising, no changes are made. The people of Arizona, through their elected representatives, pass a law on immigration, but a federal court strikes that down and says no, it can't be enforced. At a certain point, if you keep telling people that no matter how the vote goes on the Tuesday evening, on the Wednesday morning afterwards, life just goes on, we go on with this multi-trillion-dollar debt, the bureaucracy imposes a bazillion more regulations, you're telling people that serious course correction is impossible, and that's actually a very dangerous message to send. And don't take it from me, take it from Pat Cadell. Pat's analysis of that is sobering, to say the least.
Mark Steyn is the author of 9 books. Broadway Baby Say Goodnight came out in 1997. The Face of the Tiger in 2002. From Head to Toe, 2004. America Alone, a bestseller in 2006. Passing Parade, also in 2006. American Songbook, 2008. A Song for the Season, 2008 as well. Lights Out, 2009. And After America, his most recent one, came out in 2011. 2002, Face of the Tiger. Where did that title come from, Mr. Steyn?
That actually comes from a Hilaire Belloc rhyme. There was what was it? There was an old lady from Niger who went for a ride on the Tiger. How did it go? She returned from the ride, something inside, and a smile on the face of the tiger. I think that's how it goes. It doesn't really work because Niger doesn't rhyme with tiger. But at any rate, that limerick is and I had cause. The title piece in that is an essay on the death of Daniel Pearl. The smile on the face of the tiger, which I thought was for people like Daniel Pearl, who was, as you know, was a Wall Street Journal writer who was beheaded wound up beheaded in Pakistan by Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who's now in U.S. custody, in conjunction with Omar Sheikh, a student at the London School of Economics, a middle-class British subject, and it is. And Daniel Pearl, again, is not anyone's idea of a right-winger, not anyone's idea of an Islamophobe. He loved Muslim culture. He thought they loved him. He thought they trusted him. And he trusted them. And in the end, they beheaded him. And the last words he said was, "My father is a Jew, my mother is a Jew, and I am a Jew." In the end, who he was outrode his basic identity as an American Jew. That was it. That overrode every other consideration for the men who kidnapped him. They looked on him as a trophy. And it was pathetic, I think, to read the pleadings of liberal columnists in the couple of weeks he was kidnapped before the video emerged, saying, "Oh, release Daniel and he can help get your message out to the world." And it's horrible to be so stupid and misunderstanding. The beheading, the decapitation is the message. I use that image, the beguiling smile on the face of the tiger, for a collection of my columns basically from the year after 9/11, a year that in which I think things looked rather better for us than they do at this stage. But that sense of Islam, Ayatollah Khomeini, we think of as a joke, but he's not actually a joke. When he called America the Great Satan, the idea there is that America is a seducer, like Satan. He's a seducer. That's actually quite a sophisticated understanding of America's appeal to people around the world. But in the same way, the Coexist bumper sticker and multiculturalism are seducers too. And sometimes the delusions seduce people to their deaths. And the smile on the face of the tiger is a good way of looking at that.
Mark Steyn writes in The Face of the Tiger, "Even after September 11th, we can't revoke the central fiction of multiculturalism, that all cultures are equally nice, and so we must be equally nice to them, even if they slaughter large numbers of us and announce repeatedly their intention to slaughter more." National Review's John Derbyshire calls this the reduction ad absurdum of racial sensitivity, better dead than rude.
Yeah. And I think that's John Derbyshire's line, I think, is actually very good. And we see that in the willingness to concede core Western beliefs, such as freedom of speech, rather than risk allowing someone to publish a cartoon that provokes people in the streets. And just to go back to what we were talking about on that, I mean, again, I think that's sending a very different message. In a sense, if people threaten to kill you, and that threat is taken seriously, you don't actually have to kill anybody. You don't have to kill any cartoonists, because the publishers and the government ministers and the police will all instinctively preemptively surrender on these core Western values like such as freedom of speech. And it's really quite disgraceful what's happened in Europe, particularly in the last decade. The cravenness in the face of explicit threats of violence. And that's not something as contemptuous as I am of institutional leftism, I hadn't expected them to cave quite so nakedly on things like that.
Wesley Roth from Sturgis, South Dakota. Email: I enjoy listening to you on TV and when you were on Rush. Your last book, After America, was terrifying and informative, and one that every American should read. My question to you is, on any given day, where do you get your news from? What are your favorite news sites?
Well, I like to read, I mean, we were talking about Daniel Pearl just now. I love reading I like to scan the Pakistani newspapers just before I go to bed. On the one of the great things of the internet, because they're written in that slightly heightened Indian English that I enjoy reading. I love listening for the same reason. I love listening to General Musharraf. I mean, even if I disagree with what he's saying, I actually love the way he phrases it. But I think that's one of the great things of the internet. What was surprising to me was when Hollywood lefties like Tim Robbins used to reveal that before Tim turns in each night in Beverly Hills, he likes to check out The Guardian and The Independent in London, because he thinks the Boston Globe and the New York Times are just government mouthpieces, and he wants to get his real news from genuine left-wing sources. And I like doing that. I like reading the Australian papers. I like reading the Pakistani papers. And then I've got a few internet sites I like to go to. But that's one of the great gifts of the internet, is being able to read tomorrow's papers before you go to bed.
Judith in Alaska asks, please ask Mr. Steyn why he speaks with a distinctly un-Canadian accent.
Well, that's from as I said, from being in high school in Britain. And I then returned to Canada when I was 18, and I worked as a disc jockey for a bit. And I remember I'd gone to done a little course in how to talk with whatever they call it, a standard North American broadcast accent. But the first show I did was like 5 hours long, and I couldn't keep the accent up for more than 25 minutes. So I wound up lapsing into more or less how I presently talk. And it's unfortunate, because wherever I am, I sound like I'm from somewhere else. And I worked briefly for the BBC, and they were never happy with the way I pronounced certain words. Some people think I'm Australian. Some people think you can hear a bit of Zimbabwe and South Africa. But the net result of at this point in my life, I mean, I've been in New Hampshire for a long time now, and my North Country Yankee accent is coming along so great that it now takes about 1.3 seconds before people can figure out I'm not from the White Mountains. But I mean, to take that point seriously for a bit, I think one of the things it does do, I think it sometimes helps to look at a society from slightly outside it. So if, as in my situation, one is condemned by one's crippling vocal infirmity from ever passing for native, it does also offer the advantage that you can see a society from a slightly different perspective, from one remove, and I think that can sometimes be helpful for a writer.
Just a little over an hour left with our guest Mark Steyn this month on In Depth. Dave in Grantsburg, Wisconsin, please go ahead with your question.
Hi, Mark.
Hi, Dave.
My question is this: what are your views on the future relations between the U.S., Russia, and China?
Well, I think China, as I mentioned earlier, is in a position to, according to the IMF, to be the world's dominant economy by the year 2016. This is the world we made. And you can imagine, Dave, if you were somebody, say in 1980, reading that news story that China's on course to become the world's #1 economy, you would be like Charlton Heston in The Planet of the Apes. You would not recognize your own world. You would think you had landed in some alternative, bizarre future scenario. But that is the world we made, and for 35 years all the clever guys at the think tanks have been telling us that economic liberalization would bring political liberalization to China. In fact, the opposite has happened. We've helped them come up with the only economically viable form of communism. And the idea, if it's true that they're going to become the dominant economy, that will impose severe changes on the world. Now, China is demographically weak. Their great issue is that under their one-child policy, they've got tens of millions of surplus young men, and generally speaking, millions of young men who can't get any action is not a recipe for social stability. I think I say in America alone that unless that is a disastrous strategy, unless they're planning on becoming the first gay superpower since Sparta. It's basically going to cause huge problems for them. They've got an aging population. So people think that's good news, that China is not going to be the next United States. But in fact, it's actually bad news, because it means China has to use its moment. China has compelling reasons to act in what it perceives to be its own interests very fast, and those interests are unlikely to align with those of the United States. Russia is also demographically weak, but Russia Russia, in a sense, has stabilized and is actually making some significant mischief for the United States around the world. I mean, for example, Russia is quietly re-establishing parts of Central Eastern European, at least as energy dependent on Russia, on Moscow, and actually taking the view that at some point it's going to be able to reconstruct the old Soviet or Tsarist empire. I don't know whether they'll get to that, but that's their long-term strategic goal. And again, we exist in sort of happy-face banalities about this. We approach these issues still thinking that it's 1990 and we're in a unipolar world. We're not. We're in a multipolar world where the United States faces very tough strategic challenges.
In America Alone from 2006, Mark Steyn writes, "Nothing makes a citizen more selfish than socially equitable communitarianism. Once a fellow's enjoying the fruits of government health care and all the rest, he couldn't give a hoot about the general societal interest. He's got his, and if it's going to bankrupt the state a generation hence, well, as long as they can keep the checks coming till he's dead, it's fine by him. Social democracy is, it turns out, explicitly antisocial." G.W. Burkhart emails into you, Mr. Steyn, "Wouldn't the 1890s Vermonter be most astounded by the scientific advances beyond 1950, such as the ability to treat illnesses that couldn't even be diagnosed in 1950?
No, I don't think that's true. I think if you look at compare the 1920s, for example, with the 1990s, there were far more actual advances in medicine in the 1920s than there are in the 1990s, for which we had very little to show for it except Viagra. If you go back to Frederick Banting, for example, in London, Ontario, when he developed the treatment for insulin and diabetes. I mentioned in After America that took, I think it was basically a year and a half from him inventing it in London, Ontario, to it being on the counter in pharmacies in New York City. You can't do things like that now. To enter the FDA approval process is to pass through the gates of hell. Everything takes long. That's why we're not curing. That's why we have this little fracas between Susan G. Komen Foundation and Planned Parenthood. Susan G. Komen Foundation is the breast cancer people who have the Race for the Cure and the pink ribbons. I was on some plane a while ago, and the stewardess, or flight attendant I should say, the flight attendant comes out and says it's Breast Cancer Awareness Month, so for your drinks, if you chip in an extra $5 on this little commuter flight taking off 4 hours late from LaGuardia as usual, we'll give it to raising awareness for breast cancer. Who isn't aware of breast cancer? Americans need to be aware of actually how little we're doing to cure all these diseases, that the whole disease curing process has ground to a halt. Human genome, for example, was supposed to cure all these diseases, and in fact it didn't. They stumbled on things by accident. It's like disease curing now is like when you put a target on the side of a barn, and you throw an arrow at it, and it misses the target, but it lands 3 feet away from the target and happens to skewer some bug, and you think, oh wow, look at this bug I've skewered. All the beneficiaries of the Human Genome Project have been entirely accidental, because there's a reason why we've ground to a halt on the approval process, and we need, actually, I would argue, we need fewer pink ribbons, fewer of these awareness raising, and actually get down to doing more of what Frederick Banting did in London, Ontario at the end of the First World War.
Steve in Springfield emails, as post-posterity America approaches, what are the essentials for stocking the Steyn bunker? Anything besides great American songbook recordings? How is New Zealand looking to you?
Look, you know what are we thinking about New Zealand? Seriously, I understand when people send me letters like that, and it's very sweet, but honestly, this is the hill to die on. It's all very well, and I think actually you'll start seeing this. I mean, it's interesting. I think you'll see the rich fleeing for bunkers around the planet, and you know, Bermuda might be agreeable for a while, and New Zealand might be okay, but in the end it's not going to be a pleasant place to be if America crumbles into a post-prosperity ruin. This really is the hill to die on and the hill to take a stand on. And I get very worried about it. A friend of mine told me just after the collapse of Lehman Brothers in 2008, he goes to have lunch with his broker in Lower Manhattan. They're in one of these, rather like this, beautiful wood-paneled mahogany restaurant in the glittering boutique of Manhattan. And they're going there to talk about his investments, supposedly, and he's going, well, you know, Lehman Brothers has gone belly up, what do you think I should do? And this guy, his broker, says to him, oh, I would buy some land somewhere with a long growing season and a defensible perimeter. That is not... I'm happy for my New Hampshire neighbours to say stuff like that when a guy in a beautiful hand-tailored suit is saying it in a mahogany-panelled restaurant in New York. You know something is going seriously wrong. And we shouldn't be thinking, you know... Charles Krauthammer said a couple of years ago, decline is a choice. And he's right. In a sense, it's a psychological condition. But it's not an option for the United States. For post-Habsburg Vienna, decline is a choice. For France after the Second World War, decline is a choice, because it's cushioned by the United States. When the United States slides off the cliff, most of the functioning parts of the planet are going to fall off with them. So this is no time. This is no time to be making like a rat and getting on the ship to New Zealand. Stay on, even if this ship appears to be sinking, the rat should stay on it and try to save it here.
Don in Corona, California, you're on with author Mark Steyn.
Thank you, and good afternoon. Peter, thanks to you and the staff for a quality program. And Mark, thank you for your body of work. Clearly, you are a student and passionate about history. Your book, Lights Out, chronicles the current impact of the advance of political Islam. I have a two-part question.
Right.
How relevant and instructive is the history of Islamic imperialism in informing us about its actions today? And the second part, if history can be a teacher and a predictor, how do we go about changing the way Islamic history is presented in the world history textbooks used throughout our country in the 7th and 8th grade, which appear to be filled with inaccuracies, biases, and misrepresentations of that history?
Yeah, I would agree on you on that last part. We don't really have history in the American public system in a coherent sense anymore. It's mostly subsumed within so-called social studies, and history is not history merits respect, sufficient that it should have its own place on the curriculum and be taught in a coherent way. I think as regards Islamic imperialism, it's fascinating that in a sense everything that has happened in our time is foretold by the early years of Muslim expansionism. You know, we accept the Muslim world essentially operates to the Brezhnev doctrine, but with an efficiency that Brezhnev and late period Soviet Union could only admire. That once they take that land, they hold that land. When President Obama went to Cairo in 2009 to give his speech to the Muslim world, what was fascinating to me as much as anything else was that he actually said that the New York Times says President Obama goes to give speech to the Muslim world. They would never speak of the Christian world in that sense. Nobody uses the term Christendom except as a parodic term. And the Muslim world, it's worth asking, how did it get to be the Muslim world? We talk about Mesopotamia, Iraq, as the cradle of civilization, but in fact the civilization that it was the cradle of died. And it is now a Muslim country. We talk about in our own time Egypt. When the Kingdom of Egypt was founded in 1922, I believe its second finance minister was a Jew. It is inconceivable. All the Jews have left Egypt now. 90 years later it would be inconceivable for a Jew to be finance minister in Egypt. And when you study the history of either Muslim expansionism in its first centuries, from Spain to India, what's now Spain to India, or in more recent times, you understand that this is a religion, but it is also an imperialist project in a way that Christianity was not. And if you look at the differences between Christ's final message to his disciples and Muhammad's, it basically says go around the world and make them submit to Islam by conquest. Christ says go and take it around the world and preach to them and convert them to it, which is what happened. And there's a fundamental difference. They're both universalist. They're both universalist religions, but Islam takes an entirely different view of its sphere in the temporal world, and that's something we should study honestly and reach our own conclusions about.
The Washington Post says that Mark Steyn may be the world's wittiest obit writer. This is Mark Steyn's passing parade, obituaries and appreciations. And when Strom Thurmond died, you wrote about a close encounter with him, and you say that you were on the elevator with him and Senator Barbara Boxer, and you were shoved into the middle of the two of them. Ms. Boxer gave an involuntary shudder. I'd been squashed between the two for about 5 seconds when I became aware of a strange tickling sensation on my elbow. Glancing down, I was horrified to see an unusually large lizard slithering up and down my arm. What happened?
Poor old Strom Thurmond, who was then a whippersnapper. I forget how old he was when he died, 103 or something. He was then a whippersnapper of 101 or whatever it was, and he got confused and thought he was hitting on Barbara Boxer rather than hitting on. He was actually fondling my hand, I felt like he married he married several Miss South Carolinas. I think he started with Miss South Carolina 1911 and the last one was Miss South Carolina 1993 or whatever. But I felt like one of those Miss South Carolinas somewhere in the middle. I love writing. I mean, Strom Thurmond is a gift to an obituarist. I love writing obituaries. I think you have to have an affection, some kind of affection for the character, and if I'm honest, I would say that is the book of mine that I most enjoy reading. It's a miniature art, the obituary, and I love being able to write about characters like Strom.
We have about 50 minutes left with this month's in-depth guest, Mark Steyn, and our live program, and your calls continue in just a moment.
Here are the best-selling hardcover nonfiction books as of January 29th, according to the New York Times. Topping the list is talk show host Mark Levin's new book, Ameritopia, The Unmaking of America. Second is American Sniper, the autobiography of the most lethal sniper in U.S. military history, by co-authors Chris Kyle, Scott McEwen, and Jim DeFelice. Third on the list is Walter Isaacson's biography of the late Apple co-founder, Steve Jobs. Bill O'Reilly and Martin Dugard are fourth with their best-selling book, Killing Lincoln, followed by NFL quarterback Tim Tebow's memoir, Through My Eyes. Number 6 is Unbroken, the story of an Olympic runner's survival in World War II, by Laura Hillenbrand. Then David Kahneman researches the influences of human thought processes in Thinking Fast and Slow, followed by Jodi Kantor's intimate look at the first family in The Obamas. Sally Smith is ninth with her in-depth look at the Queen of England in Elizabeth the Queen. And then Catherine the Great, Portrait of a Woman by Robert Massey is 10th. For more on these bestsellers, go to nytimes.com.
Each year, Book TV brings you several events from across the country. Here's a look at some of the upcoming fairs and festivals we plan on covering this year. Book TV's first stop will be the 5th Annual Savannah Book Festival in Savannah, Georgia, over President's Day weekend. Our live all-day coverage on Saturday, February 18th will feature several author presentations, including Carl Merlantis and Pulitzer Prize finalist S.C. Gwynn. On March 10th and 11th, Book TV will be live from the Tucson Festival of Books on the campus of the University of Arizona. Our festival coverage includes numerous author talks and poets ranging from the Great Depression to forensic science. Then in late March, Book TV visits Charlottesville, Virginia for the Virginia Festival of the Book. For a complete list of upcoming book fairs and festivals, visit booktv.org and click on the Book Fairs tab at the top of the page. Also, please let us know about book fairs and festivals in your area, and we'll add them to our list. Email us at booktv@c-span.org.
We have 45 minutes left in depth this month on Super Bowl Sunday with Mark Steyn as our guest. The numbers are up on the screen. If you can, dial in if you have a question for him. And we're going to continue with our calls. Scott in Tucson, Arizona. Hi.
Hello, Mark. This is a great honor to speak to you. I have sort of a two-part question. Some of it has been previously answered. With the enormity of the U.S. military and especially its legacy weapons, i.e. our nuclear triad of defense, how will that come into factor in the declining of America and the decline of the West? Will that act as a backstop or a brake? And second of all, if America is to decline or fall off the cliff and potentially break up, how do you see that? Is it going to break up regionally or how? And I'll take my answer on the TV. Okay, thank you.
They're interesting questions, Scott. It's the idea of America's vast nuclear arsenal. Scott essentially posed a question about the nuclear arsenal, the way Washington looks at the Pakistani nuclear arsenal. What if the whole place goes belly up and the nukes fall into the wrong hands? Which is kind of fascinating. I think the problem with being a nuclear superpower is if you look at, say, Mullah Omar on September the 10th, 2011, he had Osama bin Laden and the guys living in his country plotting what, if it had gone right, would have not just taken out not just the World Trade Center, but would have, if the fourth plane had made its target, taken out either the Capitol or the White House. That was where the plane that came down in Pennsylvania was supposed to be heading to the White House or the Capitol. In other words, he would have decapitated the United States of America. And he had no fear whatsoever that the United States would respond by nuking his country. He had no fear whatsoever. And nor do any of the people running around causing America such headaches and bleeding America for 10 years in the Hindu Kush, nor do they have any worry that America is going to nuke them. In a sense, having all those nuclear weapons does not act as a deterrent if people assume you will always fight with one hand tied behind your back. I don't think the United States would nuke nuke Hiroshima and Nagasaki these days. I think they would say, well, it's probably not going to play well. We'd be better off to slog our way through a filthy, inconclusive land war there for years on end, for however long it takes. And I think that becomes a great problem when you're perceived as having this huge advantage in weaponry, but lacking the will and the strategic clarity. Now, when Scott makes his point about what things are like when the United States, in a post-prosperity United States, we were talking about overlapping zip codes, people retreating into the shadows the way so-called undocumented Americans do these days. I happen to be a legal immigrant, so I'm documented to the hilt. I think I'm over-documented, and I would greatly enjoy living in the shadows as opposed to living in the Klieg-like glare of the IRS and all the rest of it. So I think we're going to see a great increase in that, and I think you will start to see if you go, Scott is calling from I think was he calling from Phoenix or from Tucson?
No, Tucson.
Tucson. If you go south of Tucson, it's fascinating. On the highways there's a sign you see signs not that far south of Tucson saying proceed further at your own risk. On United States interstates, they're basically saying the writ of the United States no longer runs. And I think you will see that kind of bleeding sovereignty moving further and further up the country in the edge of the Southwest. I think if the dystopian scenario of After America were to come to pass, you would start to see de facto secession fiscally prudent states like Wyoming, why would they wish to be bankrupted to bail out California or New York or New Jersey? So the question then becomes, will they simply refuse certain federal fiats and federal diktats, and what then would the government of the United States do about it? I can't, to be honest, see these guys willing to wage a war to keep 50 stars in the flag. And I think you would start to see in effect a kind of green zone scenario, that there would be a nominal sovereignty exercised over the 50 states, but de facto it would bleed away pretty quickly. So I don't think it's going to be I hope the After America scenario doesn't come to pass, but I think the idea that a large country can't, you know, Iceland can collapse and rebuild itself, and even somewhere like Greece can collapse and rebuild itself, but a nation of 300 million from Maine to Hawaii cannot collapse and reconstitute itself in the same form.
From Pat, an email: your statistics concerning the Islamification of Europe and the hyper-multiculturalism of America are very impressive, yet your warnings are toothless without a call for the cessation of all further third world immigration to Western nations. Why invade and or drone strike Afghanistan and Pakistan while at the same time accepting Faisal Shahzad, the Times Square bomber, as a new immigrant and U.S. citizen?
Yes, I wouldn't disagree with that. I'm opposed. I'm an immigrant, and I tend to feel uncomfortable talking about immigration issues for that reason, because I'm not sure it's certainly, having been admitted to this country, it's not my business to tell you, okay, now pull up the drawbridge and keep everybody else out. But I think there's a difference between individual immigration and mass immigration. And I think mass immigration is a very difficult to justify in a rational sense. The way that Western nations have found to justify it is as a sign of moral virtue, we concoct various reasons nobody's quite persuaded by. For example, President Bush's line, we need immigrants to come here to do the jobs Americans won't do. The question then, I think, is, well, why won't Americans do those jobs? In part because it becomes very difficult for people stay in college longer. Nobody wants to go and do casual agricultural labor for a couple of summers or whatever. But a dependence on mass immigration is always a weakness. It's always a structural weakness, and you should address it as a structural weakness rather than using it as an opportunity to flaunt your multicultural bona fides. And I think it's the tragedy of post-war Europe that rather than address those structural weaknesses honestly, it chose to transform itself demographically, and there will be consequences for that. But yes, until the mid-1960s, every Western nation took it as entirely normal that it had the right to determine who it gave access to its society to. Faisal Shahzad, the Times Square bomber, is not an American. He never pretended to be an American. He gamed the system, as all manner of other people game the system year in, year out, in the United States, in Canada, in Britain, in Europe, in Australia. And at some point, Western immigration authorities have to say, what is the cost-benefit analysis here? 40% of French imams are on the dole, so the economic rationale makes no sense. If you look at Tensta, which is a suburb of Stockholm, an extraordinary proportion of middle-aged immigrant women are claiming welfare. This idea that somehow everyone outside the Western world are sort of hard-working, honest, virtuous people who want to come here and work from dawn till dusk in a way that decadent Western nations no longer do. Even if that were true, they land at the airport, they figure out within 6 weeks that they're living in very generous welfare states, and they figure out how to game the system. There's no rational basis for mass immigration other than the fact that it enables guilt-ridden white liberals to flaunt their multicultural bona fides. And it's fascinating to me that, for example, Japan has severe demographic crises, but in an odd way, I would bet on Japan being the first Western nation to figure out some way through it, precisely because it doesn't have the competing problems of mass immigration.
In After America, Get Ready for Armageddon, Mr. Steyn writes, an election is one Tuesday every other November. The culture is every day, every month, every year. Politicians are, for the most part, a craven, finger-in-the-wind bunch. Like Milton Friedman says, don't wait for the right people to get elected. Create the conditions whereby the wrong people are forced to do the right thing. This email from Tim Long. Enjoy reading this tweet. Enjoy reading Mr. Steyn's work, but can't reconcile respect for his writing, thinking with him hosting for a demagogue like Rush.
Well, Rush isn't a demagogue, and many of the people who criticize Rush don't listen to him that much. He's actually a very funny guy. He has great wit. You can't do that thing 3 hours a day for 20 years without being wit and without great wit and without being able to see the comedy in your own side. To connect that to the passage you read, I think what people resent about Rush is that he doesn't subscribe to the niceties of the broader culture. And I think this is the difficulty for the right. I guest host for Rush, and I love guest hosting for Rush, and every time I guest host for Rush, a couple of people say, well, wouldn't you like to do your own 3-hour talk radio show? And I keep saying, no, the right doesn't need a 3-hour talk radio show. We've conquered that market. We have a hammerlock on it. It would make more sense if some guy wants to host a 3-hour talk radio show instead to decide he wants to write a sitcom or make a movie or buy a newspaper or operate in any of those parts of the culture that the right has gradually abandoned. And I think that was what the 2008 election confirmed. Barack Obama is really a cultural figure rather than a conventional political figure in the sense that Joe Biden or Bill Clinton are. He's the product of the broader cultural smog. You can't, and if the right is still largely bewildered as to how he managed to get elected. But to go back to that point, if you say, if you concede sitcoms, if you concede the newspapers, if you concede the mainline churches, if you concede the motion picture industry, if you concede the universities and the high schools and the middle schools and the kindergartens, why be surprised that there's fewer and it becomes more and more difficult to get people to pull the lever for conservative candidates every other November? The whole kind of social justice, climate change, far too much of this has become the sort of air that we breathe. And we have to get back in the game on the fronts where we have ceded that turf. We have to get back in the game on television, in pop music, in all kinds of other areas.
In America alone, and even if you're truly a moderate Muslim, why should you be expected to take on the most powerful men in Islam when the West's media and political class merely pander to them? What kind of support does the culture give to those who speak out against the Islamists? The Iranians declared a fatwa on Salman Rushdie, and he had to go into hiding for more than a decade while his government and others continued fawning on the regime that issued the death sentence. The Dutch filmmaker Theo van Gogh spoke out and was murdered, and the poseur dissenters of Hollywood were too busy congratulating themselves on their courage and bravery in standing up to Bush, even to mention their poor dead colleague in the weepy Oscar montage of the years deceased. To speak out against the Islamists means to live in hiding and under armed security in the heart of the so-called free world.
Yeah, which I think is disgraceful. And I think, just to go back to that business of Theo van Gogh, who was murdered in the streets of the Netherlands, and a letter threatening similar death to Ayaan Hirsi Ali and Geert Wilders was pinned to the poor guy's chest. The Oscar ceremony that year, I forget what they were congratulating themselves on. I think George Clooney had made a film about McCarthyism because, you know, for Hollywood that remains the most significant event of the last 5 millennia, and they'll be making films about McCarthy. If there is a Hollywood, they'll be making films about McCarthyism 1,000 years from now and congratulating themselves and giving themselves awards for it. This is a guy who's murdered because he's made a film. And why isn't he in the weepy Oscar obituary montage? It was very bizarre. I was, you know, I was sent a copy of Geert Wilders' forthcoming book. This is a guy who, again, he has a particular view on Islam, but ever since the murder of Theo van Gogh, he has lived under armed guards. Talking about Hollywood, he said he has never seen, since whatever this, Van Gogh was murdered in, what was it, 2002, I believe? In the last decade, he has never seen a film, the beginning or end of a film, because occasionally his bodyguards, he and his wife, would like to get out and see a movie. So they'll be taken out and they'll go and see Harry Potter or whatever it is, but they'll miss the first 10 minutes and they'll miss the last 10 minutes, because to get them into the theatre with the bodyguards requires that kind of thing. And it is absolutely despicable. It is absolutely despicable for Hollywood not to show solidarity with these people. There's so much fake courage in the world, and in my own profession, writers congratulate themselves on showing courage and all the rest of it. The people who, the solidarity that was shown with Salman Rushdie, mostly by his North London fellow dinner party novelists back in the late 80s, would not be shown now. As the South Park incident illustrated, everyone just goes very quiet about it these days. And I think Rushdie himself, who had to cancel an appearance at a literary festival in India just a couple of days ago, would be the first to say that even the tepid support he received almost 25 years ago, he would not get now.
Next call from Mark Steyn. About 30 minutes left with our guest. Comes from Lyle in Marion, Ohio. Lyle, you're on Book TV.
Yes, hi, Mark.
Hi, Lyle.
I want to thank you for the work you've done and the risks you've taken on behalf of free speech. And I'd like to recommend to viewers that if they want to see some really chilling examples of what can happen when political correctness is enacted into law, they ought to nose around YouTube and watch some of the encounters that you and Ezra Levant have had up there in Canada. But what I really wanted to ask you about is Ayaan Hirsi Ali. I see that you list her as one of your greatest influences, and I just admire her greatly. And I wondered if you'd comment a little bit about her, and if you've met her, any stories that you might be able to tell about her. Thank you.
Well, I have met her. I usually run into her at these conferences and things where we're speaking, and for a long time she was she's a Dutch Somali lady who was a member of Parliament in the Netherlands, and she wrote the film that got Theo van Gogh murdered, and has since had to live under armed guard. And for a while, when I used to run into her, she would be flanked by, she's very tall, Somali women are very tall, and Dutch men, I believe they're also the tallest men in the developed world. So whenever I saw her, she used to come into the room, this beautiful, tall black Somali woman with these tall Dutch, blonde, very Aryan white men flanking her. They looked like a sort of Vegas act. They looked like she looked like some kind of singer with backing singers. It was I always found that very sort of oddly memorable when she did that. But here's why I put her on that list, is because she had a choice. She could have, when her director, Theo van Gogh, was murdered, she could have done the easy thing. She could have hopped on a plane, gone to live in New Zealand, changed her name, had a quiet life, or at least attempted to have a quiet life, far away, and retreated from the world. And she didn't. She said, no, I'm not going to put up with this. She believes, I don't agree with her on everything, but I think she's absolutely clear-sighted on the importance of not surrendering and not handing people who try to shut you up a victory by going away to the other side of the world and just leading a quiet life. And every time I get stupid death threats from Islam, and I think I've had enough of this, I just would like it to go away. I wish it was, 20 years ago when you never had to hear about this stuff, and I'd like to just go back to writing about well-loved songs and favorite singers and all the rest of it. I think of Ayaan Hirsi Ali, and I think if she can put up with this stuff, then the least I can do is put up with it too. So I congratulate her on her courage. I'm slightly in awe of her courage, and I think the least that those of us who operate in this sphere can do as well is say, I'm with Ayaan Hirsi Ali. If you want to kill one of us, you'll have to kill us all. You better have a lot of rusty scimitars for your beheading videos, because you're going to have to chop us all our heads off. And that's why I admire Ayaan Hirsi Ali.
Stephen Wynn emails into you, Mr. Steyn. Are you still in non-compliance with the New York State Bureau of Compliance?
Yes, I was. I walked into the office. One of the things, I love this country, but I had no idea what a bureaucratic hell it is. I made the mistake of hiring somebody from New York State, which I would never do again. No disrespect to her, but I had never had more paperwork to deal with. I would hire somebody from the Solomon Islands or Tuvalu or the Cook Islands rather than hire someone from New York State and I can't be the only employer who thinks like that. But after changing our workman's comp insurer and all the other things we had to do for the privilege of hiring someone in New York and paying the New York commuter mobility tax and all this other stuff, I then wander into the office one morning, and my assistant is looking rather ashen-faced at an official-looking envelope, and it's a letter from the New York State Bureau of Compliance informing us that we're in non-compliance with the New York State Bureau of Compliance, and the fine for that is $14,000, which sounds to me, like a suspiciously round number. I would have found it more plausible if it had been $14,073.82. And I was a bit shocked by this at first, but I now put it on my business card. I put Mark Steyn, author, columnist, in full non-compliance with the New York State Bureau of Compliance. I think we should all be. I'm interested. As we decay into societal ruin, of forming an alliance of non-compliance. I think it's what's needed in the face of this hyper-bureaucratic state.
Well, you don't conclude it in your book, but do you pay them the money?
No, I didn't. Have you gotten
another letter?
No, they have. I forget what the last letter said, but they're not. They're going to have to claw that 14 grand out of me from my cold dead. I gave a speech in Albany shortly after that, and I said to the people there, I'm very glad you turned up, but if you do hear the doors being kicked down, it's just the Bureau of Compliance SWAT team to collect that 14 grand. Well, I'm not giving 14 grand to the. They've wasted all the money I've paid them on the New York State commuter mobility tax and all the other stuff. They don't need another 14 grand from me.
Jean emails in, I am starting a charter school in Utah using the Hillsdale Curriculum Guide. Although they have great classroom book lists, I still need to stock our library. Do you have any books or lists of books you would recommend for children, kindergarten through 8th grade?
I'm actually thinking of doing an anthology of children's literature, because I'm one of the things that's as Stephen Fry. I was on a show where the host with Stephen Fry, who plays Jeeves in the PBS series Jeeves and Wooster, and he's in the new Sherlock Holmes film. And the host did that. He had his question. It fell out of his hand onto the carpet. Stephen picked it up very coolly and said, "I'll take questions from the floor." So I'll take questions from the floor. I'm actually thinking of doing an anthology of children's literature, because I'm horrified at the sort of soul-sapping quality of a lot of books that grade schoolers read. And one of the things I like about classic children's literature is they're unsparing about the realities of life. There's a blogging comrade of mine up in Canada who blames Sesame Street for what he calls the demonsterization of childhood, that he thinks things like the Cookie Monster are actually harmful, that you teach children that there are that monsters are just monsters are just cuddly friends we haven't offered enough cookies to yet. And I prefer classic children's literature in terms of you'll get far more greater sense of the realities of life from the Brothers Grimm than you will from the Cookie Monsters. I may yet do a children's anthology.
Stephanie emails in, I just finished Broadway Babies, and I was wondering if you could say some words about the state of Broadway in the years since your book. Especially, I am interested in what you thought of the more irreverent shows like The Book of Mormon and Avenue Q, and further, what's it like to be a conservative who enjoys Broadway?
Well, just to answer that last one quickly, I'm always very grateful to my showbiz friends, because there always comes a point where they'll be at a dinner party in London or New York or Beverly Hills where the rest of the crowd will reel back and say, "Wow, you're a friend of that Mark Steyn guy," and I'm grateful for their support. I love the heyday of the Broadway theatre, and I think when you see The Book of Mormon, or even the producers, Mel Brooks' highly skilled Broadway version of his film, in a sense you're running on fumes. What you've got there is in a sense a skilled mimicry of the form, but it's not actually, to me it's not as satisfying as if you were at the first night of Showboat in 1927, December 26th, 1927, and you're sitting there in the front row and you're hearing Old Man River for the first time, and you're hearing Make Believe for the first time, and you're hearing this amazing music for the first time. And I wonder, all the time I was a theatre critic, I always wanted to have that. I always wanted to feel like the way you'd feel at a Rodgers and Hart show in the 1930s. You were hearing Lady is a Tramp for the first time. You were hearing Bewitched, Bothered and Bewildered for the first time. What must that feel like to be? You were hearing My Funny Valentine for the first time. To be in on the ground floor of something that's going to be forever. And you don't. I'm sorry, but going to the Book of Mormon, going to the Drowsy Chaperone, going to Avenue Q is not the same, and it's not necessarily the fault of the creators of those shows. It's just that it's just that Broadway's relationship to the sort of central cultural throughway of American life has changed. I don't know how you get back to that. I don't know how, different places have different responses. If you go to the West End, in London, it's full of all these really lousy third-rate. There's a Rod Stewart musical. Rod Stewart, I got nothing against, Rod Stewart. Well, actually I have. His terrible albums, Rod Stewart Slays the Great American Songbook and everything. But Rod's like a delightful, darling fellow. But with the best will in the world, the idea of taking all Rod's hits, and putting them in a show and calling it a musical, it's not a musical. I mean, these are responses to the fact that that musical theatre is no longer the great central throughway of popular culture, and I don't know what you do about that. But a Rod Stewart musical is not, except I'd be in favour, by the way, of a Rod Stewart musical in Kandahar when they raided Mullah Omar's compound. As you recall, he had banned music throughout Afghanistan, and they found, when they raided his compound, he had all these illicit, illegal cassettes of Rod Stewart singing If You Want My Body and You Think I'm Sexy, which is apparently Mullah Omar's favourite song. By the way, I like to say that because I'm hoping the Sterner imams in whichever cave he's holed up in Waziristan now will understand he's not quite on board with the strictures on music, and when they catch up with him, his Rod Stewart tastes will count against him.
Who are some of your Broadway friends, and what kind of politics have you discussed with them?
Well, I love the way, when America Alone came out, I used to get a lot of emails from actually some pretty A-list celebrities in Hollywood. It was interesting. They all ended with, it was all, "I loved your book, it's a terrific book, but please don't mention my name." And the idea of like being a big above the title star and not being able to say you like America Alone is bewildering to me. But I have. I've been around. I love that. This, to me personally, there's still nothing like sitting at the back of the theatre, which I do occasionally for friends who are producers or whatever, at a show that's in trying out or is just doing a run through, just sitting at the back and looking at what's maybe this number in Act 2 would be better if it was moved from here to here, and that stuff is fascinating to me, and I love doing that, and I still get I love the sort of there's something the sort of show busy side is fun, and you have to accept that. Tony Bennett the other day made some idiot on I think it was the 10th anniversary of 9/11, and he did one of these "Who are the real terrorists" things, and you just have to accept that. I think you have to accept that some guys, they're like what orchid growers call sports, that they are so sort of unique and special. They're in a world of their own, and the idea, Tony Bennett sings. Why would you expect him to have a coherent view of geostrategic threats? It's not his bag, man,
Mark Steyn, before we got started, you talked about a political conversation you had with Elaine Stritch.
Oh, right. Can I say that word?
Sure, yes, we are cable.
Oh.
We will just warn you ahead of time.
Okay. I was on I was around Elaine Stritch, who brassy broad, who sings the Stephen Sondheim song "I'm Still Here," and it has a wonderful, very funny one-woman show that she tours around at the moment. She's getting up there in years, but she made her debut in a Broadway review back in the 40s, in which the first song she sang was "Bongo Bongo Bongo, I don't want to leave the Congo, oh no 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 no." And, I happened to be on a show with her, and she was talking about this and saying "Bongo Bongo Bongo, I don't want to leave the Congo, oh no 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 no," and the host said to her, "Oh, who wrote that song?" And she said, "Oh, I'm ashamed to say I've forgotten. I can't think of the name." And I just happened to be sitting next to her, so I chipped in and said Bob Hilliard and Carl Sigman, who wrote that song. And Elaine Stritch, with the conversation then moved on to politics, and she and I did not agree on anything in that sphere. And at the end of the show, she turned to me, she goes, "You may be full of shit, but you know who wrote Bongo Bongo Bongo." And I think that would be a fine epitaph to have on my tombstone.
Joe McCutcheon in Ellijay, Georgia, you were on the Washington Journal this morning, but we'll let you very quickly make a comment about Mitt Romney.
Pete, he said that wouldn't count this morning because he invited me, so that wouldn't count for my 30 days. But I just want to say that, I wanted to ask you, Mark, great. I enjoy when you substitute for Rush. The bunch of us down here that are really fired up about Mitt Romney. What do you think about his odds of receiving the nomination and being elected president? I hope you say he will be elected president. Thank you so much, Peter.
Well, I think there's no doubt. Mitt is on course to the nomination. That's just the way it is. He had a blowout in Nevada last night, and I thought Newt did himself huge damage by scheduling this wacky press conference and complaining bitterly about the unfairness of it all. Yes, it's unfair. It's what it is. There's no. I doubt whether you could construct an entirely rational system to devise a nominee for the presidency of the United States. It's what it is, and you just have to roll with it. And Newt whining about the unfairness of it, I thought made him look pathetic. So I thought, regardless of what one feels about Mitt Romney's performance in Nevada, Newt's reaction to it actually told its own story. So I think he is going to be the nominee. I hope he means what he says, because if Obamacare is not killed stone dead in the next year, it will never be killed. And government health care fundamentally transforms the relationship between the citizen and the state. I don't want to see that. I hope Mitt Romney honors the 3 or 4 key pillars of his platform, and we will be in way better shape. But to go back to that line I used right at the beginning about the IMF saying that by 2016 China is on course to become the dominant economic power by then. That means this guy elected in November will be the first president. If that happens, he'll be the first president since Grover Cleveland to find himself in the number 2 role. And Mitt Romney, I hope, understands how important it is for him, if he finds himself in that position, to be committed to reversing it and rolling it back, because that's what we need, serious course correction.
In our time, Mark Steyn writes, to be born a citizen of the United States is to win first prize in the lottery of life, and as Britons did, too many Americans assume it will always be so. Do you think the laws of God will be suspended in favor of America because you were born in it? Great convulsions lie ahead, and at the end we may be in a post-Anglosphere world.
Yeah, I was modifying both Cecil Rhodes and George Bernard Shaw there from his play Heartbreak House. And that was Rhodes's great line. He said, to be born an Englishman is to win first prize in the lottery of life. Today, to be born an American is to win first prize in the lottery of life. That's what these fellas at the Occupy Wall Street thing don't get. You know, the guy who gets up in Bangalore and the Indian guy in Bangalore, the fellas all over Chinese, gets up in the morning, goes to work, puts in a full shift at the factory in Bangalore to make the little toys that the guys protesting at Occupy Wall Street listen to their music on. There is no permanent law of the planet Earth that says the guy in Bangalore who works harder than you to make all your little toys should always be poorer than you in perpetuity, and you should always live better than him just because you were born in Berkeley rather than Bangalore. Those are not permanent facts of life. And the complacency, we were talking about the 1950 American moment earlier. What's pathetic about the Occupy Wall Street guys, for their so-called youth, is that their assumptions of permanence about the 1950 American moment are as complacent as their grandparents in that sense. And eventually, no, economic reality asserts itself, and people say, well, the guy in Bangalore, he works harder, he's there, he's putting in the hours, eventually he will get the bigger bang for the buck, and the guy lying around doing half a decade of whatever studies at Complacency U, that simply does not have economic value in the real world. So the facts of life eventually reassert themselves, and that's the point that George Bernard Shaw was making in Heartbreak House.
PJ in Missoula, Montana. Good afternoon.
Mr. Steyn, I have 2 questions for you. One, you were talking a little while ago about our decreasing liberties in this country.
That's right.
PJ, you still with us? You gotta really hurry here because we're almost out of time. Decreasing liberties, please go ahead. And I apologize. We have, for whatever reason, the phone has gone out. John in Louisville, Kentucky. Please go ahead with your question for Mark Steyn.
Mr. Steyn?
Hi, John.
I'm here with my son, David. He's 15. We're both huge fans. It's an honor to speak with you. And if you ever need to get down to the Bible Belt, you can come visit us in our conservative bubble. You'd be very comfortable down here, I'm sure.
The last time I was in Louisville, I think I landed there prior to visiting Santa Claus, Indiana, just across the border, not too far away from you.
Know it well. A quick question. You know, I talked to some of my, conservative friends, and something that seems like it's a common feeling is that, when we act as Christians and trying to speak out as conservatives in a way consistent with the kind of things that you talk about, we feel like we're acting alone against a group. And it's a perception, I don't know how real it is, that when we're, a friend of mine said it felt like, he's running a flag against an army, and he turns around and no one's running with him. And it's I guess the question would be, short of a major event, a cataclysm of sorts, or some gross overreach that really kind of unites conservatives to act together. Is that an issue that you see, that we tend to act as individuals, or feel like we're acting as individuals as conservatives, and the response?
Yeah, but
John, we're going to leave it there. Thank you.
But it's never a numbers game, and it never is a numbers game. Often the people who mean it tend to get it. I mean, to go back to what we were talking about when Muslims complain about Danish cartoons versus what happens when Catholics complain about Terence McNally's play. At a certain visceral level, the authorities understand that the Muslim complainants mean it. And it's never a numbers game in that sense. It's about credibility. It's about speaking up. It's about speaking up forcefully. And the idea of looking around and expecting there to be 20,000 people standing behind you, one day there will. One day there will be. But if you wait for the crowd of 20,000 people to be there before you speak up, it'll be too late. I shouldn't need to tell this to Americans, because as Canadians will point out, the majority of the population of New York State, for example, were not in favor of the American Revolution. It wasn't a numbers game back then. And if you go, as you know, if you go along the border to what they call the Empire Loyalist parts of Ontario, where people who fled New York State after the Revolution, a lot of them wound up. It's not a numbers game. It's not. It's about the power of ideas. Don't schedule a meeting and expect there to be 20,000 people there. If you're lucky, there'll be 20 people there, and if what you say is right, then the next meeting there'll be 200, and one time there will be 20,000. But you can't wait. You can't wait for a majority. The power of ideas is not driven in that way.
Mark Steyn, final question. This is from Jim Hines, who has sent in about 1,001 tweets today. Hair, Godspell, Evita, or Rent, which is your favorite, or of those, or are they all just awful?
Well, Evita, Tim Rice is an old friend of mine, and I would be remiss in not selecting Tim's work. Tim is a very gifted lyric writer. He doesn't write in the way that Cole Porter or Lawrence Hart does, but there's a voice and there is a distinctive use of language. I love language. Tim said to me, I once asked him about a Christmas record he'd made for Perry Como, a Christmas song he'd written, and halfway through a bunch of kids come in and start singing in German. And I said to Tim, did you write the German lyrics? He said, no, I just wrote the English lyrics. And halfway through, a gang of lederhosen-clad nippers come in and start warbling away in Germany. And I thought only someone who takes pleasure in language would use that phrase.
We have been talking for the last 3 hours with author Mark Steyn. Very quickly, here are his books. Broadway Babies Say Goodnight, The Face of the Tiger, From Head to Toe, America Alone, Passing Parade, American Songbook, A Song for the Season, Lights Out, and his most recent, After America. Steyn Online is his website. Mr. Steyn, we appreciate your time today on Book TV.
My pleasure, Peter. Great fun.
Thanks for being with us.
You're watching Book TV on C-SPAN.